"She's gone," the doctor said, and pulled the sheet over Margaret Whitmore's face. Daniel grabbed his arm. "She is still breathing. I can see her chest moving." The doctor stepped back. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand this is difficult. Take that sheet off my mother, right now." Nobody moved. And in that silence, a young nurse nobody had ever noticed walked through the door, looked at the chart, looked at Margaret, and said quietly, "He's right. She's still here." If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Daniel Whitmore had not slept in 51 hours. He knew the exact number because he had been counting since the moment his phone rang in the middle of a board meeting in San Francisco, and his assistant's voice came through the line with that particular careful flatness people use when they are about to deliver news they do not want to be responsible for delivering. "Mr. Whitmore, it's about your mother." He had left the meeting without a word, left his jacket on the chair, left his phone on the table with 14 unread messages from the company's legal team, left everything. He had driven to the airport instead of calling a driver because calling a driver meant waiting, and waiting was the one thing Daniel Whitmore could not do. Not tonight, not with those words still echoing. "It's about your mother." He had arrived at Silver Creek Memorial Hospital at 11:43 in the evening, still in his dress shirt, with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, still wearing the watch that had cost more than the annual salary of every nurse on the floor combined, and the first thing he had done was demand to see the head of cardiology. The head of cardiology was a man named Dr. Richard Holt, 62 years old, 3 decades of experience. The kind of doctor whose name appeared on the plaques that lined the hospital's main corridor. He had met Daniel in the hallway outside room 114 with the practiced gravity of a man who had delivered difficult news so many times that he had learned to wear it like a suit. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for coming so quickly." "What is happening with my mother?" It was not a question. Daniel did not ask questions when he already knew the answer was going to be something he did not want to hear. He had learned that in business. The way you phrased things controlled the room. Statements were harder to deflect than questions. Dr. Holt folded his hands. "Your mother suffered a significant cardiac event 4 days ago. We've been managing her condition aggressively, but her response to treatment has not been what we hoped." What does that mean? It means her heart function is declining. Her kidneys are showing stress. She developed a secondary pulmonary complication 2 days ago that has further compromised her ability to... What does it mean for her survival? The doctor paused. The kind of pause that said more than the words that followed it. "We are doing everything within the standard of care to keep her comfortable and to support her remaining organ function. But at her age, with the extent of the damage..." "I didn't ask about her age. I asked about her survival." Dr. Holt looked at him, not unkindly, but with the specific weariness of a man who had stopped believing that money or willpower could alter cardiac physiology. "Mr. Whitmore, your mother is 72 years old. Her heart has sustained damage that we cannot reverse. Our honest assessment is that she has perhaps 48 to 72 hours. Daniel stood very still. He had built a company from nothing. He had survived hostile takeovers and market crashes and the kind of betrayals that would have broken most men. He had stood in rooms full of people who wanted to see him fail, and he had walked out of every single one of those rooms standing upright. But in that hallway, outside room 114 with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the distant sound of a monitor beeping somewhere down the corridor, Daniel felt something shift inside him that no boardroom had ever managed to move. "I want a second opinion." "Of course. We can arrange." "I want it tonight. I want whoever you have on call. I want a cardiologist, I want a pulmonologist, and I want someone from nephrology, and I want them all in that room within the next 30 minutes. Dr. Holt nodded slowly. "I'll make the calls. And I want to see her." He walked into room 114 alone. Margaret Whitmore was smaller than he remembered. That was the first thing that hit him. Not the machines, not the tubes, not the particular antiseptic smell of a room where someone was fighting to stay alive. It was how small she looked in that bed. His mother had always been the largest presence in any room she entered. Not in terms of size, she was barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, and had been telling people she was 5'4" since 1987. But in terms of force, Margaret Whitmore walked into rooms and people noticed. She had that quality, a kind of magnetic purposefulness, like she knew exactly where she was going and had decided the universe was going to cooperate. But the woman in the bed looked fragile. Her hands were resting at her sides on top of the blanket. Daniel looked at those hands for a long moment. He knew those hands better than he knew his own. He had held one of them crossing the street until he was embarrassed to still be doing it, which had been approximately age 10. He had held one of them at his college graduation when she had cried in a way she immediately tried to disguise as allergies. He had held one of them the night 3 years ago when she had called him at 2 in the morning because she thought she heard someone outside, and he had stayed on the phone with her for 2 hours, even though she was 500 miles away, and there was absolutely nothing he could do except talk. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. "Hey, Mom." She didn't open her eyes, but something in the rhythm of her breathing shifted. Something small. Something that might have been nothing. Daniel told himself it was not nothing. "I'm here. I know I should have come sooner. I know." He stopped, tried again. "The doctors are telling me some things I don't particularly want to hear, so I'm going to need you to work with me here." Nothing. "I called in some additional consultants, real specialists, not the guys they have here, no offense to—" He stopped himself. His mother had spent 30 years telling him not to be a snob about things like small-town hospitals. "I mean, I want to make sure we're looking at every option." "Okay, so I just need you to hang on a little longer. Can you do that?" The monitor beeped. The IV dripped. The rain tapped against the window. He did not leave. The specialists arrived by midnight. Daniel had used his phone to make 3 calls and his name to make 2 more, and by 12:15 there were 4 additional physicians standing around his mother's bed, reviewing her chart with the careful neutrality of professionals, being observed by someone who was paying attention. He watched them. He watched their faces. He had learned over years of business that the information people tried to hide was always more valuable than the information they volunteered. He watched their eyes when they looked at the numbers. He watched their hands when they made notes. He watched the specific quality of silence that fell over the room when the pulmonologist finished reading the most recent imaging reports. The pulmonologist was a woman named Dr. Sandra Chu. She had flown in from Portland, which had required Daniel to make a phone call that he would later be billed $4,000 for, and she stood at the foot of Margaret's bed with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and a look on her face that Daniel had learned to recognize as the professional equivalent of a chess player who has just realized they are 3 moves from checkmate. He stepped outside the room. He waited. 20 minutes later, Dr. Holt came out and joined him in the hallway. Then, Dr. Chu. Then the cardiologist whose name Daniel had already forgotten because he had been focused on whether the man's credentials matched what he had told Daniel's assistant over the phone. "Well," Daniel said. "Mr. Whitmore." Dr. Holt clasped his hands. "The consultants have reviewed your mother's case. I want to first say that I appreciate you arranging this a second set of eyes as always. What did they find?" Dr. Chu was the one who answered. Daniel appreciated that. She looked at him directly, and she spoke without the careful cushioning that Dr. Holt seemed to prefer. "Your mother's primary diagnosis is consistent with what Dr. Holt's team identified. Severe cardiomyopathy with secondary pulmonary complications. The cardiac damage is extensive. Is it reversible? Portions of it may respond to treatment, but the cumulative stress on her system, the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, creates a very difficult picture." Define difficult. "In our combined assessment, aggressive intervention carries a significant mortality risk. Her body may not tolerate the stress of certain procedures. At the same time, without those procedures, her decline will continue." Daniel looked at her. "So what you're telling me is that the aggressive option might kill her faster, and the conservative option definitely kills her slower." Dr. Chu did not look away. "That is an accurate summary. What's the aggressive option?" She told him. It involved a procedure to address a specific mechanical problem with the heart's electrical function combined with a targeted medication protocol to reduce fluid accumulation in the lungs. Risky. Stressful to the system, not guaranteed to work, but possible. Daniel asked 4 more questions. He listened to the answers. He asked one more. If this was your mother, what would you do? The room was very quiet. Dr. Chu looked at him for a long moment. I would take the night to think about it. I've been thinking about it since I walked in that door. What would you do? She took a breath. I would want to know everything was being looked at. I would want to feel certain that every possibility had been considered. Has it been? And there was the pause again, that specific pause, the one that told Daniel there was something nobody was saying. Has every possibility been considered? He said again, quieter this time. Dr. Holt shifted his weight. We've been comprehensive in our approach. You didn't answer the question. Mr. Whitmore, I can assure you. I'll answer it. The voice came from behind them. Everyone turned. Standing at the nurse's station 10 feet away was a young woman in scrubs. She was holding a chart. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical way, and her shoes were the kind that nurses wore on night shifts, worn comfortable things that had seen a lot of floor. She looked 25 or 26, maybe younger. She looked like the kind of person who was usually invisible in a room full of physicians and specialists. She was looking directly at Daniel. No, she said. Every possibility has not been considered. The air in the hallway changed. Dr. Holt turned to look at her with the particular expression of a senior physician being interrupted by a junior nurse. It was not a kind expression. Emily, this is a private family consultation. I know. She did not move. But I've been looking at your mother's chart for the last hour, and there's something that needs to be said. Daniel stared at her. Who are you? Emily Carter. I work nights. She's one of our nursing staff, Dr. Holt said in a tone designed to convey that this was a complete description. Emily, I appreciate your concern, but the physicians have this. There's a drug interaction in her medication history that nobody has flagged. She said it plainly, without apology, without drama. Just the way someone states a fact they are certain about. Your mother started a course of amiodarone 8 months ago, for arrhythmia. The prescribing physician noted it in her primary care records. It's not in her current medication list. Silence. Dr. Holt frowned. That medication would have been discontinued before admission, yes, but amiodarone has a half-life of 40 to 55 days. It doesn't just leave the system when you stop taking it. It accumulates in tissue, and 2 of the medications in her current protocol interact with residual amiodarone in a way that can. She stopped and then kept going because nobody had told her to stop. That can cause exactly the pattern of cardiac and pulmonary symptoms your mother has been showing. Nobody spoke. Daniel looked at the specialists. He looked at Dr. Holt. He looked at Dr. Chu. Is that true? He said. Dr. Chu had taken her reading glasses off her forehead. She was frowning at the chart she was suddenly very interested in holding. The interaction is documented, she said slowly. It's uncommon, but nobody checked. The amiodarone wasn't listed in the active medications, because she had stopped taking it, but it was still in her system. Daniel turned back to Emily. Is that what you're saying? Emily looked at him. Yes. And if the protocol is adjusted, it wouldn't fix the underlying cardiac damage, Emily said. I want to be honest about that. The damage is real. But if the current medications are contributing to the rate of decline, removing those interactions gives her a better baseline to work from. It doesn't guarantee anything. But right now, some of what's happening to her might not be entirely what we think it is. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. She was younger than he'd expected. She looked tired the way people who work nights look tired, a specific bone-deep weariness that they had learned to carry without letting it show in their face. Her badge said, Emily Carter, RN. Nothing impressive. Nothing that would catch your eye in a hallway full of doctors with credentials after their names. But she was the only person in that hallway who had just said something he had not already heard. How long have you been looking at her chart? He said. About an hour. Why? She seemed to consider the question. Because she reminded me of my grandmother. The honesty of it stopped him. He had expected something professional, a procedural explanation, a justification. Not that. "Come in," he said. "Tell them what you told me. All of it." What followed was 30 minutes that Daniel would think about for years afterward. Emily stood in the hallway and she talked. She talked without notes. She had clearly memorized the chart or most of it, or at least the parts that mattered, and she walked the physicians through what she had found with the calm precision of someone who had been waiting for permission to say these things and was now using every second of that permission with complete efficiency. She was not aggressive. She was not confrontational. She acknowledged every limitation of her position without being apologetic about the substance of what she was saying. She said, "I could be wrong twice." She also said, "But I don't think I am," both times immediately afterward. Dr. Holt interrupted her 3 times, each time with a technical objection. Each time Emily waited until he finished and then addressed the objection specifically without losing her thread. Dr. Chu did not interrupt. She asked 2 questions. Both of them were the questions of a person who was genuinely trying to determine whether what they were hearing was accurate, rather than the questions of a person who had already decided it wasn't. By the end of it, the cardiologist had pulled up something on his phone and was reading with the focused urgency of a man who had just realized he might have missed something. Daniel watched all of it. He watched the way the room shifted. He watched the moment when Dr. Holt's objections became slightly slower and slightly less certain. He watched the moment when Dr. Chu's expression moved from professional skepticism to something that was very carefully not surprise. He watched Emily Carter, who was standing in her worn shoes in a hospital hallway at 1 in the morning, explaining something that 3 specialists had missed and doing it without raising her voice. "What would you recommend?" Daniel said. Emily blinked. "I'm a nurse. I'm not in a position to. I'm asking you what you think. Not as a medical directive. As a person who has clearly been thinking about this more than anyone else in this hallway." She looked at him for a moment. "Adjust the medication protocol. Remove the 2 agents most likely to be interacting with the residual amiodarone. Give her body 24 hours without those interactions and see what happens to her baseline numbers." And the procedure Dr. Chu mentioned. That decision gets clearer after 24 hours. Right now you're looking at a picture where we're not sure how much of it is the underlying disease and how much is the medication effect. You'd be deciding based on incomplete information. If we wait 24 hours, I know. Her voice didn't change. It's a risk either way. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see. Daniel turned to Dr. Chu. Is what she's describing medically sound? Dr. Chu looked at the chart, looked at Emily, looked at the chart again. The interaction she's identified is real. The question is whether it's contributing to the current presentation significantly enough to, could it hurt her to try the adjusted protocol? Removing those 2 medications reduces her current symptom management. There's some risk in that. Compared to the risk of the aggressive procedure you described earlier. Lower. Then do it! Daniel looked at Dr. Holt. Tonight. Start tonight. Dr. Holt opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his colleagues, made the specific face of a man who was deciding whether to push back against a decision he hadn't made and wasn't sure was wrong. "I'll need to document the rationale," he said finally. "Document it however you need to. Just start." He looked at Emily. She had stepped back slightly the way people do when they have said what they came to say and are preparing to become invisible again. "Thank you," Daniel said. She nodded once, started to turn away. "What did you say your name was?" She turned back. "Emily Carter?" "Emily Carter." He said it like he was filing it somewhere, like he was making sure he would not forget it. "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't pride. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something quieter than either of those things. "She's still fighting," Emily said. "Somebody just needed to notice." And then she walked back to the nurse's station, picked up the next chart on the pile, and went back to work. The next 6 hours were the longest of Daniel Whitmore's life. He sat in a chair outside room 114, and he did not move. His phone lit up with messages he didn't read. A nurse brought him coffee that he drank without tasting. The rain kept falling outside the windows, the same rain that had been falling for 3 days, and the hospital moved around him in its quiet nighttime rhythm. The soft footsteps, the occasional distant beep, the murmured conversations at the nurse's station that he could hear but couldn't quite make out. He thought about his mother. He thought about the years he had spent telling himself that providing financially was the same as being present. He had set up automatic payments to her accounts. He had sent her the best medical insurance money could buy. He had called every Sunday, well, most Sundays, most weeks, when there wasn't a crisis at the company that required his attention, and he had told himself that this was what care looked like. This was what a successful son did. He gave his mother security. He gave her comfort. He gave her anything she needed, except the one thing that apparently she had actually needed, which was for someone to sit in the hospital the first night she was admitted and read her chart the way Emily Carter had read it. Someone with no title, no credentials that mattered in this hallway. No reason to be paying attention at 1 a.m. to the medication history of a woman she had never met. Except that she had looked at his mother and seen a person. Not a case. Not a set of numbers. Not a 72-year-old with declining organ function. A person who reminded her of her grandmother. A person who was still fighting. Daniel sat outside room 114, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Ashamed, not of anything specific, of the general shape of things, of the way he had arranged his life so that money substituted for presence. Of the 37 times in the last year he had told himself he would visit soon. Of the way he had walked into this hospital, assuming his resources would solve the problem the same way his resources solved every problem. And of the fact that what had actually come closest to solving the problem was a young nurse in worn shoes who had spent an hour reading a chart because his mother reminded her of someone she loved. He thought about Margaret Whitmore, at 34 years old, working a double shift at a diner and coming home to make dinner for a 7-year-old who didn't understand why his father wasn't there anymore. He thought about her selling the one piece of jewelry she had kept from her own mother so that Daniel could go on a school trip he had mentioned wanting to go on once and immediately forgotten. He thought about her sitting in the 3rd row of his college graduation in a dress she had bought at a consignment store, crying and trying to pretend she was sneezing. He thought about who his mother was, not who she was to him. Who she was. And he understood for the first time why a stranger would spend an hour reading her chart at 1 a.m. Because people like Margaret Whitmore deserved that. They deserved someone looking one more time. They deserved someone who refused to accept that the numbers were the whole story. He got up. He walked to the nurse's station. Emily was there writing something. She looked up when he stopped in front of the desk. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "Why the amiodarone? Why did you catch that when nobody else did?" She looked at him for a moment. Her primary care records were in a different system than her hospital records. It's a common problem with patients who transfer in from outside the area. The two systems don't always communicate. Her amiodarone prescription wasn't visible in the main patient file because it had been discontinued before admission, so it wasn't flagged as an active medication. If you weren't specifically looking for prior cardiac medications in her external records, you wouldn't know to look. But you looked. "I look at everything." She said it simply. "I've worked 3 different emergency departments. You learn that the thing you almost didn't bother checking is usually the thing that matters." "How long have you been a nurse?" 6 years. Started at 22. Daniel looked at her. 28 years old. Working nights in a small-town hospital. Wearing shoes that needed replacing. Spending her break reviewing the medical records of a patient who was someone else's responsibility. "Why Silver Creek?" he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not much, just a flicker. "My brother lives here. He needed someone close. He didn't push." He had learned something about Emily Carter in the last 2 hours, which was that she answered questions plainly and completely, but only answered what was asked. She did not volunteer things about herself. He recognized the habit because he had built the same one for different reasons. "My mother is lucky you were working tonight," he said. Emily looked at him. "Let's see how her numbers look in the morning before you say that." The morning numbers were different, not miraculous. Daniel had been warned not to expect miraculous, but different. Dr. Chu came in at 7, with a look on her face that was the medical equivalent of someone who had been proven wrong about something and was processing it with professional composure. "Her cardiac rhythm has stabilized," she said. "The pulmonary readings are improved from yesterday's baseline. It's early and we need to continue monitoring, but the adjusted protocol appears to be having an effect." Daniel sat very still. "What does that mean for the procedure?" "It means we have more information than we had 12 hours ago. It means her baseline is stronger than we thought." She paused. "It means there may be more options." He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them. "Where is Emily Carter?" "Night shift ended at 6. She went home." Daniel nodded. He looked at his mother, who was still sleeping, still connected to the monitors, still fragile in ways that were not going to resolve themselves quickly or easily, but breathing, stabilized, giving him more time. "When does her next shift start?" he said. "Tonight. 7. He nodded again. He pulled his chair back to his mother's bedside. He took her hand, the right one, which was the hand he had always held, and he held it, and he did not check his phone, and he did not think about the company, or the meetings, or the 14 unread messages from the legal team. He thought about his mother. He thought about what she had built with her hands, and her stubbornness, and her absolute refusal to accept that love meant anything less than showing up. And he sat there with her in room 114 while the rain finally slowed, and the morning light came through the window, and for the first time in 58 hours, something in his chest loosened enough to let him breathe. Margaret Whitmore was not out of danger, but she was still here, and she had a nurse who had refused to stop looking, and she had a son who was beginning to understand what it meant to finally see. The hospital did not celebrate what Emily Carter had done. That was the first thing Daniel noticed when he came back from the parking lot after a 2-hour sleep in his car, the specific absence of acknowledgement in the way the day shift staff moved through the corridors. Nobody was talking about the medication interaction Emily had identified. Nobody was talking about the 12 hours of adjusted protocol that had moved Margaret Whitmore's numbers in a direction that 3 specialists had not managed to achieve. The morning rounds proceeded with the measured calm of an institution that had decided to incorporate a correction without drawing attention to the fact that a correction had been necessary. Dr. Holt stopped by room 114 at 8:15. He reviewed the chart. He noted the improvements with the careful neutrality of a man describing weather. "The adjustments appear to be having a stabilizing effect. We'll continue monitoring." He did not mention Emily. He did not mention the conversation in the hallway at 1 in the morning. He did not mention the hours she had spent reading records that nobody else had bothered to cross-reference. Daniel watched him leave and understood something about how institutions protect themselves. They absorbed the correction. They moved the numbers into the column marked "Response to Treatment." They continued forward as though the treatment had always been heading in this direction, and the night shift nurse who had stopped it from heading in a different direction entirely was simply part of the general machinery that produced good outcomes. He let it go. For now. What mattered was his mother's breathing. What mattered was that the pulmonologist had used the phrase "stronger baseline" and meant it. What mattered was that Margaret Whitmore was still in room 114, which was where Daniel needed her to be. He went back to her bedside, ordered breakfast from the hospital cafeteria that he didn't eat, and waited for 7 o'clock. Margaret opened her eyes at 10:42 in the morning. She did not say anything at first. She looked at the ceiling, then at the window, then at Daniel, and her expression moved through several things in quick succession: confusion, recognition, relief, and then something that was very specifically and characteristically Margaret Whitmore, which was an immediate attempt to assess whether the people around her were all right. "You look terrible," she said. Her voice was rough, quieter than usual, but it was her voice. Daniel felt something break open in his chest. He reached for her hand. "Hi, Mom. Have you slept? Some?" "That means no." She looked at him more carefully. "How long have I been here?" 5 days. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she looked less like she was trying to remember, and more like she had remembered and was deciding how to respond to the information. "They told me it was serious." "It is serious. It's getting better, but it's still serious." "Okay." She said it the way she had said okay to every difficult thing Daniel could remember her facing, which was with the specific brevity of a woman who had processed and accepted things faster than most people managed to even understand them. "Are you eating?" "Mom, I'm asking a question. I ate this morning." "What did you eat?" "Something from the cafeteria." She gave him the look, the one she had been giving him since he was 11 years old, and trying to convince her that a bag of chips constituted an adequate meal. "You need to go get real food. Go to that diner on Cascade Street, the one with the green sign. You remember it." "I'm not leaving the hospital." "Daniel, I'm not leaving." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was simultaneously exasperation and something much softer than exasperation. She squeezed his hand. "I'm not going anywhere while you go eat breakfast." "You don't know that." "I've been saying that to stubborn people my whole life, and I'm still here." He almost laughed. He hadn't laughed in 5 days, and the almost of it felt strange in his face. "I'll get something from the cafeteria." "The Green Sign Diner." "Cafeteria. You are exactly as difficult as you were at age 7. I learned from the best." She made a sound that was close to a laugh, and then winced slightly, and Daniel was on his feet immediately. "Are you in pain? Should I call?" "I'm fine. Sit down. You standing up like that makes me nervous." She waited until he sat. "Tell me what happened. What are the doctors saying?" He told her. He kept it factual. He left out the part where he had sat in the parking lot at 4 in the morning trying to remember if he had told her he loved her the last time he'd called. He left out the part where he had held her hand for an hour at 2 in the morning, talking to her even though she couldn't hear him, because talking had felt better than the alternative of sitting in silence with his own thoughts. He told her about the medication interaction, about the adjusted protocol, about the improving numbers, about the conversations with the specialists. When he mentioned Emily, Margaret's expression changed. "The young nurse," she said. "You remember her?" "I remember her voice." She looked past him for a moment at something he couldn't see. "She was in the room with me at some point. I couldn't respond. But I could hear things. Not everything. Pieces." She paused. "She talked to me. Not about medicine. She just talked, like I was a person." Daniel said nothing. "She told me something," Margaret said. "I don't remember all of it. But I remember she said something about not giving up." She looked at him. She meant it. You can tell when someone means something like that. "She found something in your chart that—" "I know. You told me." Margaret looked at him. "But that's not the only thing she did. The medicine part, yes. But she also she sat with me. When she didn't have to. When nobody was watching." She paused. "That matters more than people think it does." Daniel thought about Emily at the nurse's station picking up the next chart on the pile going back to work after 30 minutes of standing in a hallway telling 3 physicians something they hadn't wanted to hear. "I know," he said. "Jamais." Emily arrived at 7 that evening. Daniel had been watching for her. He was not particularly proud of this. There was something slightly undignified about a man who ran a 9-figure company, positioning himself near the elevator bank to catch a night shift nurse when she came in for work. But he had been watching for her, and when she came through the door in her worn shoes with her badge clipped to her scrub pocket, he stepped forward before she reached the nurse's station. "Mr. Whitmore." She looked mildly surprised. "How is she?" "She woke up this morning. She told me I looked terrible and asked if I was eating." Something moved across Emily's face. Real relief. Not professional courtesy. Actual relief. That's good. That's really good. I wanted to tell you, and I wanted to ask you something. She looked at him with the careful attention of someone who has learned that conversations beginning with "I wanted to ask you something" can go in directions that require preparation. Okay, she said. The hospital hasn't said anything about what you found, about what you did. She was quiet for a moment. That's not unusual. It should be unusual. You, Mr. Whitmore? Her voice was calm, not defensive, not resigned, just calm in the way of someone who has made peace with a specific reality. I adjusted how I was approaching a concern about a patient's chart. The medical team made the actual decisions. That's how it's supposed to work. That's not what happened. That's how it will be documented. He looked at her. Does that bother you? She considered the question seriously, which he was coming to understand was what she did with questions. She didn't deflect. She thought about things before she answered. It would bother me if it meant worse care for patients going forward. If the lesson the hospital takes from this is that nurses should stay in their lane, then yes. That bothers me. She paused. But if your mother is getting better, then the important thing happened. I can live with how it gets categorized. That's an unusually generous way to look at it. It's practical. I don't have the energy to fight every battle. She shifted slightly. Is that what you wanted to ask me about? No. He stopped. I wanted to ask how you knew. About the amiodarone. What made you look at the external records? Emily tilted her head slightly. I was in the room when the night team was changing her IV. I noticed the rhythm on her cardiac monitor was showing a specific kind of variability that doesn't fit cleanly with standard heart failure. It's a pattern I've seen before in a patient in Portland who turned out to have a similar interaction issue. It was years ago, but I remembered it because the patient deteriorated very fast and we almost missed it. So when I saw the same pattern, I went looking. You remembered a cardiac monitor pattern from years ago and connected it to a patient you'd never treated. I have a good memory for patterns. She said it without any particular pride. It was a statement of professional fact. And I don't like it when things don't add up. That's an understatement. The corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile. I should get started on my rounds. One more thing. She waited. Is there anything you need? Anything I can do? I don't mean... He stopped himself because he had been about to say money, and had caught himself because he was trying to learn something about how not every expression of gratitude needed to be financial. I mean anything, whatever would actually be useful to you. Emily looked at him for a moment. There was something in her expression that was more complicated than a simple, "No, thank you." Something that was working through a question of its own. I appreciate that, she said finally. Right now I just need to do my job. And she went to do her job. What Daniel did not know yet was what Emily had left out of that conversation. He did not know that 2 hours before her shift started, Emily had been called into the office of the hospital's director of nursing, a woman named Carolyn Marsh, who had 15 years of administrative experience and the specific talent for institutional self-protection that such experience tended to produce. The meeting had lasted 22 minutes. Emily had sat across from Carolyn Marsh in the small office with the motivational poster on the wall that read, "Excellence in Patient Care." And she had listened to 22 minutes of language that was never overtly hostile, but was constructed with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to deliver a warning without technically issuing one. Carolyn Marsh had said things like, "We appreciate your dedication to our patients," and "Of course we want all staff to feel empowered to raise concerns through appropriate channels," and "I'm sure you understand that direct communication with family members and specialist consultants falls outside the standard nursing scope in situations like this." She had said, "I'm sure you understand," 4 times. Each time it preceded something that Emily was fairly certain she was not supposed to find acceptable. The phrase "appropriate channels" appeared 7 times. Emily had said very little. She had learned early that in meetings like this one, the less you said, the fewer things they could use later. She said, "I understand," and "I followed what I believed to be in the patient's best interest," and "I documented everything contemporaneously." She said that last thing very specifically, and she watched Carolyn Marsh's expression register the meaning of it, which was that Emily had written everything down in real time, and the documentation existed and was accurate. This changed the temperature of the meeting slightly. By the end, Carolyn Marsh had not issued a formal reprimand. She had not done anything that would appear in Emily's personnel file. What she had done was make it very clear that a pattern of what she called scope deviation would be something that the hospital would need to address formally if it were to continue. Emily had thanked her for the conversation. She had walked out of the office, stood in the hallway for exactly 30 seconds, and then gone to the locker room to change into her scrubs. She had not told anyone. She had not told Daniel Whitmore, who was waiting by the elevator bank to thank her. She had not told the 2 nurses on her unit, who had heard pieces of what had happened the night before, and were watching her with the particular solidarity of people who wanted to say something supportive, but weren't sure what was safe to say out loud. She had gone to her nurse's station, and she had started her rounds because the patients on her floor did not stop needing care, because the administration had spent 22 minutes reminding her of the boundaries of her position. She had a patient in room 108 who was post-surgical and anxious. A patient in room 111 whose family had not been in to visit in 3 days, and who talked too much when she was lonely. A patient in room 116 with pain levels that weren't being adequately managed, and who needed someone to push back on the resident who had dismissed his concerns during morning rounds. She went to each of them. She did not think about Carolyn Marsh. She thought about her patients. Bento. Margaret was awake when Emily came to check her vitals at 8:30. "You're the one," Margaret said immediately. Emily looked up from the chart. "Ma'am?" "The nurse from last night. My son told me about you." Margaret was watching her with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 7 decades reading people and had gotten very good at it. "He said you found something the doctors missed. The medical team made the necessary adjustments," Emily said. "It was the safe answer. The documented answer. That's not what my son said. Your son is grateful. Grateful people sometimes emphasize certain details. My son is a lot of things, but he doesn't exaggerate what happened. He underplays things usually." Margaret continued watching her. "You sat with me. When I couldn't respond, you talked to me." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes it helps to hear a voice." "What did you say to me?" Emily thought about it. She remembered, actually. She remembered exactly what she had said, because she had said it and meant it, and those were always the things that stayed with you. "I told you that you didn't have to be afraid, that your son was there and he wasn't going anywhere, and that your body was stronger than the numbers suggested." She paused. "And I told you that I wasn't giving up on you." Margaret's eyes had something in them that was not quite tears. Close to it but controlled. "Why?" "Because you reminded me of someone." "My son said that." "Who?" "My grandmother." Emily set the chart down and gave the woman her full attention because some moments required that. "She raised me and my brother after our parents died. She worked 3 jobs. She never complained about it once, not once in her entire life." She stopped. "She died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. It went very fast." She looked at Margaret. "I couldn't save her, but I was there with her at the end. And I talked to her the same way I talked to you." The room was very quiet. "I'm sorry about your grandmother," Margaret said. "I'm sorry about what you've been through this week. It's been quite a week." Margaret looked at the window, then back at Emily. "What's your name?" "Emily Carter." "Emily." She said it like she was storing it somewhere important. "I want you to know something. What you did, I know what it cost." Emily kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Margaret's voice was gentle but certain. "I worked in a hospital for 11 years. Not as a nurse. I was in dietary. But I know how these places work. I know what happens to the people who speak up." She looked at Emily directly. "Did anyone talk to you today?" Emily was silent for just a half second too long. "I see," Margaret said. "I'm fine. Your numbers are good tonight. Your blood pressure is—" "Emily." She stopped. "You sit down for 1 minute," Margaret said. "Just 1 minute. The chart can wait." Emily looked at the door, looked at the chart, looked at this 72-year-old woman who was supposed to be the fragile one, and was looking at her with the steady, focused concern of someone who had spent a lifetime being the person who paid attention. She sat down. "Tell me about your brother," Margaret said. It was so unexpected that for a moment Emily just looked at her. "Why?" "Because you came to this town because of him. My son mentioned it. And I think when someone does something like what you did last night, it's usually because they understand what it means to fight for someone. So tell me about your brother." Emily was quiet. She had a particular habit of silence before she talked about Nathan. She had been practicing that silence for 2 years, ever since she had moved to Silver Creek, ever since she had begun to understand that Nathan's situation was more complicated than he had originally told her. "He's 24, she said. "His name is Nathan. He had a significant accident 2 years ago, spinal injury. He has some function back, the therapy helped, but he needs ongoing care and he can't work full-time right now." She said it the way she always said it, factually, without the parts that came after the facts, which were the 3 jobs she had briefly worked simultaneously. The apartment she lived in that she had chosen because it was a 10-minute drive from Nathan's place, and not because of anything she actually wanted for herself. The raise she had been told she was in line for at her previous hospital, that she had walked away from because Nathan needed her in Silver Creek specifically. "How long have you been supporting him?" Margaret asked. 2 years. "On a night shift nurse's salary." "We manage." "I'm sure you do." Margaret said it without condescension, with a kind of recognition. "I raised my son on a diner salary and what was left of a life insurance policy that barely covered 2 years of expenses. You find a way." She looked at Emily. "Does Daniel know about your brother?" "He asked. I gave him the short version. He'll want to do something." "I know." Emily looked at her hands. "I'm not going to let him." "Why not?" "Because I didn't do what I did for a reward. I did it because it was right. And if I accept something in return, it changes what it was." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I understand that. I do. I've felt exactly that way." A pause. "But can I tell you something I learned after a long time of feeling exactly that way?" Emily looked at her. "Letting people help you is not the same as being bought. Accepting kindness is not the same as owing someone." Margaret's voice was even, patient, like someone reading a map to a person who has been lost for a long time. You can do something good because it's right, and still allow someone to respond to it with generosity, and neither of those things cancels the other out. They're both just true at the same time. Emily said nothing. "You remind me of myself at 28, Margaret said. "I thought independence meant never needing anything. It took me about 20 years, and most of my health to understand that what it actually means is knowing when you can carry something yourself and when you should let someone carry it with you." Emily stood up slowly. She picked up the chart. "Your blood pressure is good. Your cardiac rhythm looks stable. I'll be back to check on you at midnight." "Emily," she stopped. "Thank you for saving my life." Emily turned back. She looked at Margaret Whitmore in the hospital bed, this woman she had sat with in the middle of the night and talked to when she couldn't hear, this woman who had looked at her tonight and seen things she hadn't said. "Thank you for waking up," Emily said. She went back to her rounds. At 10:15 that night, everything changed. Emily was at the nurse's station when her phone showed a notification from the internal system, a flag on the medication records for room 114. She pulled it up. Someone had entered a new order into Margaret's protocol, a physician's order time-stamped 9:58. She read it. Then she read it again. One of the medications that had been removed from Margaret's protocol, one of the 2 that Emily had identified as contributing to the problematic interaction, had been re-added. Emily stood very still. She pulled up the ordering physician. The name listed was Dr. Holt. She pulled up his notes from the evening. There was a notation. Patient showing signs of fluid retention, reinstating diuretic agent for symptom management. Emily looked at Margaret's vitals from the last 2 hours. She looked at the fluid balance numbers. She looked at the progression. The fluid numbers had moved, marginally, within a range that could be managed by other means. By the kind of watchful adjustments that required attention rather than a pharmacological intervention that would reintroduce the exact chemical dynamic that had been causing the problem. She stood there for 30 seconds. She thought about Carolyn Marsh's office. She thought about appropriate channels. She thought about the 22 minutes and the motivational poster. She thought about Margaret Whitmore's heart rhythm at 1 in the morning and what it was going to look like in 4 hours if this order was implemented. She picked up the phone and called the on-call physician. Not Dr. Holt. The on-call physician was a hospitalist named Dr. James Reyes, who had been practicing for 9 years and who Emily had worked with 3 times and who had demonstrated on each occasion the quality she was counting on right now, which was the willingness to actually listen to what she was saying. Dr. Reyes, it's Emily Carter in Unit 3. I have a concern about a medication order for the patient in room 114. Go ahead, she told him. She told him quickly and specifically, citing the interaction, citing the pattern, citing the improvement in the 24 hours since the medications had been removed, citing the marginal nature of the fluid retention that was being used to justify the reinstatement. There was a silence on the line. The order is from Dr. Holt, Dr. Reyes said. I know. He's the attending of record. I know. She kept her voice level. I'm not asking you to overrule him. I'm asking you to review the clinical picture before the order is administered. If you review it and you agree with his assessment, then we administer the medication. But I would like someone to review it first. Another silence. Longer this time. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Dr. Reyes said. He was there in 8. He reviewed the chart. He reviewed the vitals. He reviewed the medication history and the interaction documentation that Emily had added to the record at 1:30 that morning because she had documented everything contemporaneously, as she had told Carolyn Marsh. He was quiet for a long time. The fluid retention is marginal, he said. Yes. There are alternative approaches. Yes. He looked at the order. He looked at Emily. He made a decision. He placed a call to Dr. Holt. Daniel was in the hallway outside room 114 when he heard voices he recognized, and some he didn't, coming from the direction of the nurses' station. He walked toward them. He arrived in time to hear the tail end of a conversation between Dr. Holt, who had come in from home still in his street clothes, and Dr. Reyes, who was calm and specific and relentlessly factual. Emily was standing to the side. She was not speaking. She had said what she needed to say. She had put the information in front of the people who had the authority to act on it, and she had stepped back, and now she was watching with the focused patience of someone who has done everything within their power and is waiting to see whether it will be enough. Daniel looked at her. She did not look back. She was watching Dr. Holt. The conversation between the two physicians lasted 6 minutes. By the end of it, the order had been placed on hold pending further review of the fluid management plan. Dr. Holt used language that was carefully clinical and not at all personal. Dr. Reyes confirmed the hold in the system. Dr. Holt left without looking at Emily. Dr. Reyes looked at Emily. He said quietly, "Nicely caught." He left. Emily stood at the nurse's station. She picked up the next chart. Daniel walked toward her. She looked up. "That was about my mother," he said. It was not a question. A precautionary review of her medication protocol. She said it steadily. "Is she all right?" "She's stable. Her numbers are good. I'm going to check on her in..." Was that going to hurt her? Emily looked at him. She thought about the safe answer. She thought about documentation and appropriate channels and 22 minutes in an administrative office. "Yes," she said. "Probably. Over time." Daniel was very still. There was an order placed tonight to reinstate one of the medications that was removed from her protocol, the one most likely to be contributing to the interaction. Emily said it plainly. I asked Dr. Reyes to review it before it was administered. He did. He placed it on hold. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Dr. Holt placed the order, he said. Emily said nothing. He understood what her silence meant. He stood there in the hallway of Silver Creek Memorial Hospital at 10:30 at night, and he put the pieces together, and the picture they assembled was one that he recognized from his own industry. He recognized the mechanics of institutional self-preservation. He recognized the specific logic of a senior physician who had been quietly made to look careless and was now consciously or not reasserting his authority in the one way that was technically within his rights. He recognized it because he had operated in structures like that his entire professional life. What he had never done was stand in the middle of one and understand what it cost the person who kept speaking up. Emily, he said. She looked at him. Is your job in danger? She held his gaze. I'm a good nurse. I do my job. That's not what I asked. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped. The night sounds of a hospital, ordinary and unceasing. I have documentation of everything, Emily said. I'm careful. I follow procedure. She paused. But I also know what this hospital is like, and I know what happens to people who become inconvenient. You've been inconvenient twice in 24 hours. Yes. And you still made the call to Dr. Reyes. She looked at him steadily. Your mother's cardiac rhythm would not have tolerated the reinstatement, not at this stage. What would you have had me do? He had no answer for that. He had absolutely no answer for that. Go be with her, Emily said. I'll check on her in 45 minutes. She went back to work. He went back to room 114, and he sat beside his mother, and he held her hand. And he thought about the specific quality of a person who understood exactly what the cost of doing the right thing was going to be, who had already paid a version of it once today, and had walked straight toward the opportunity to pay it again at 10:15 that night without hesitating. He thought about what that kind of person was worth. He thought about what the world did with people like that, and how often it failed them, and how many Emilys there were out there, in worn shoes, in night shifts, in small hospitals, paying the price of caring too much, fighting for people who didn't know they were being fought for. Margaret stirred in the bed. Daniel, she said, still mostly asleep. I'm here. Is Emily still here? She's working. Good. She settled. She's a good one. He looked at his mother's face, at the easier rhythm of her breathing, at the small movements of a woman who was sleeping instead of fading, and he thought about the order that had been placed in the system at 9:58, and the phone call that had been made at 10:15, and the 8 minutes between one and the other that had mattered more than most meetings he had ever attended. Yeah, he said. She is. Outside the window, the rain had finally stopped. The sky was clearing for the first time in 4 days. And somewhere on the 3rd floor of Silver Creek Memorial Hospital, a night shift nurse in worn shoes was writing her notes with complete precision, documenting everything, because she understood better than most that the truth only protects you if you can prove it existed. The medication hold lasted 14 hours before someone overturned it. Daniel found out the way. He found out most things in this hospital, not because anyone told him, but because he had started paying attention to the specific silences that preceded bad news. He noticed it in the way Dr. Holt's resident moved through the hallway at 7 the next morning with the careful purposefulness of someone executing an instruction rather than making a clinical decision. He noticed it in the updated medication order that appeared in the system at 7:14, which he only saw because he had asked the unit clerk to show him how the patient portal worked and had been reading it on his phone for the last hour. He went to find Emily. She had just come off her night shift. She was at the locker room door, code in hand, when he came around the corner. They reinstated the order, he said. She looked at him. She already knew. Dr. Holt reviewed the overnight vitals and determined that the clinical picture supported the original decision. The clinical picture hasn't changed from last night when Dr. Reyes put it on hold. Dr. Holt is the attending of record. He has the authority. Emily. She stopped. You've been awake for 12 hours. You caught this twice. And now they're undoing what you caught. He looked at her. Tell me what you actually think. She was quiet for a moment. She had a coat in one hand and a bag over her other shoulder, and she looked like what she was, which was a person at the end of a long night who had not yet been given permission to stop working. But she looked at him with that same steady attention she gave everything. I think, she said carefully, that your mother's fluid retention is manageable without that medication. I think the reinstated agent carries a risk of reintroducing the interaction dynamic we've been trying to correct. I think the improvement in her baseline over the last 36 hours is real and fragile, and certain decisions made in the next 24 hours could affect whether that improvement holds. That's what you think medically. Yes. What do you think is actually happening? She looked at him for a long moment. The honest answer was visible in her face before she gave it. I think Dr. Holt made a decision yesterday that he wasn't consulted on, and then had that decision reviewed and corrected by a colleague, and I think that matters to him, professionally. She paused. I'm not saying that's why he reinstated the order. I'm saying I don't know that it isn't. Daniel stood very still. In his company, he had a rule. The rule was that you did not allow ego to drive clinical decisions, business decisions. Yes, ego was unavoidable in business, and you managed it rather than eliminated it. But anything that touched product safety, anything that touched people's lives, you removed ego from the equation, and you looked at the facts, and you made the call the facts supported. He had built that rule after a mistake early in his career that he had spent 8 years trying not to repeat. He understood standing in this hospital hallway that he was watching someone else make exactly that mistake. And the person whose life was at the intersection of that mistake was his mother. I'm going to talk to the hospital administration, he said. Something shifted in Emily's expression. Not alarm exactly, something adjacent to it. Mr. Whitmore, I'm not going to let this go. I understand that, but if you go to administration about Dr. Holt specifically, they will look for a reason that his decisions are being second-guessed. And the most available reason is me. She said it without drama, as a fact. I've already been called into the director of nursing's office once. If this escalates, it won't be Dr. Holt who pays for it. Daniel looked at her. He understood exactly what she was telling him. When were you called in? Yesterday afternoon, before my shift. And you didn't tell me. It wasn't relevant to your mother's care. It was relevant to whether the person watching out for my mother still has a job tomorrow. She was quiet. Emily, how serious was it? She considered what to tell him. He could see her deciding. She didn't file anything formal, but she made the expectations clear. If there are more incidents of what she called scope deviation, the next conversation will have documentation attached. Scope deviation. He said the phrase with a specific flatness that conveyed everything he thought about it. That's the institutional term for a nurse who exceeded her lane. Her lane. You identified a medication interaction that 3 specialists missed. You made a call last night that, I know what I did, Emily said, not sharply, but firmly. And I would do it again. But I need you to understand that my ability to keep doing it depends on me still being employed here. And if you go into the administration offices this morning with my name attached to a complaint about Dr. Holt, my ability to be here for your mother for any patient goes away. She looked at him. So I'm asking you to wait. He wanted to argue with her. The argument was already forming, the one about how this kind of institutional cowardice was exactly what was wrong with every large organization he had ever encountered. The one about how protecting people like Dr. Holt at the expense of people like Emily was a system failure that he had the resources to address. But she was right. She was completely right, and she was looking at him with the patient certainty of someone who had thought about this more carefully than he had, and he recognized that his instinct to act immediately was not about his mother's welfare or Emily's. It was about his own need to do something, anything in a situation where his usual tools kept proving inadequate. "Okay," he said. "I'll wait." She nodded once. "Get some rest and eat something." She started toward the door, stopped, looked back. "The green sign diner your mother mentioned. It opens at 6. The eggs are good." She left. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went to the diner with the green sign, and he ordered eggs, and he sat at the counter, and he ate them slowly, and he thought about what it cost a person to carry what Emily Carter was carrying, and what it said about him, that he had needed her to explain the consequences to him before he'd been willing to consider them. Margaret's condition worsened that afternoon. Not dramatically. Not in the way that brought doctors running. In the quiet, incremental way that people who monitored numbers for a living would recognize as a trend rather than an emergency. A slow downward drift in the cardiac output readings. A subtle shift in her respiratory rate. A fluid balance moving in the wrong direction. Daniel was in the room when the day nurse checked vitals at 2 o'clock. He watched the nurse's face as she read the numbers. He had gotten good at reading those faces. "I want to talk to someone," he said. "Dr. Holt or whoever is available." "I'll page the physician." The physician who arrived was not Dr. Holt. It was a hospitalist named Dr. Patricia Warren, who had an open face and the particular directness of a person who had learned that oblique communication caused more problems than it solved. She reviewed the chart. She reviewed the current vitals. She looked at the medication record. Then she looked at Daniel. "When was this agent reinstated?" 7:14 this morning. She went back to the chart. She was quiet for long enough that Daniel understood she was seeing something. "And it was on hold overnight?" "Yes." "On whose order?" "Dr. Reyes placed the hold. Dr. Holt reinstated it this morning." She kept looking at the chart. Her expression was neutral, but her attention was very focused. "I'm going to make some calls. Can you give me about 20 minutes?" "I'll be right here." She left. Daniel sat beside his mother. Margaret was awake but less alert than she had been that morning. The brightness that had been in her eyes when she'd told him he looked terrible and asked about his breakfast felt further away. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "Something's wrong." "They're looking at your numbers. It got worse." It wasn't a question. She said it with the flat accuracy of a woman who had learned to read the energy in a room and could read her son's face better than he realized. "Since this morning. Some readings have shifted. They're reviewing it." "Daniel." "Mom, tell me the truth." He looked at her. He had been telling her careful truths since he arrived. Managing information with the instinct of a person who believed that controlling information was a form of protection. He looked at her, and he saw that she was 72 years old and had been making hard decisions with accurate information her entire life, and that she deserved the same. "The medication they put back in your protocol this morning may be contributing to some of the changes in your numbers. There are people looking at it. Dr. Warren is making calls right now." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Emily said something like this might happen. He looked at her sharply. "When?" "Last night. She came in at midnight for her check. She sat for a few minutes." Margaret looked at the ceiling. "She didn't tell me what was happening specifically, but she told me that my care team would be monitoring the medication protocol very closely, and that if I felt anything different, more fatigue, more difficulty breathing, I should call the nurse immediately." She looked at him. She was warning me, without telling me what to be warned about. Daniel thought about Emily at midnight doing her rounds, walking into room 114, and sitting for a few minutes, giving his mother information she had encoded as general instruction, because she couldn't say directly what she suspected. She had prepared his mother for this. Even then, even knowing what the cost to her might be. She had walked in there at midnight, and she had made sure Margaret knew what to watch for. He stood up. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. He went to find Dr. Warren. He found her at the nurse's station, phone in hand, looking at the screen with the concentrated expression of someone who had found something they weren't expecting. "Mr. Whitmore." She looked up. I've been reviewing the medication history for the last 48 hours alongside your mother's vitals. There's a correlation that I think needs to be formally reviewed. What kind of review? A case review. I want to pull in Dr. Reyes and the attending of record and look at this comprehensively. She paused. I also want to reach out to the specialist consultant Dr. Chu who was here 2 nights ago. She noted the interaction in her documentation. How long will that take? I can get people together by this evening, 4 or 5 o'clock. She looked at him. In the meantime, I'm going to place a temporary hold on the reinstated agent until we can convene the review. I have the authority to do that as covering hospitalist. Do it, Daniel said. She did it. Right there. She entered the hold in the system while he watched. He was about to walk back to his mother's room when he saw from the corner of his eye Dr. Holt come through the unit door. Dr. Holt saw Daniel at the nurse's station. He saw Dr. Warren beside him. He looked at the medication system screen still visible on the workstation. He stopped walking. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Dr. Holt walked to the station. His expression was professionally composed, but his eyes went immediately to the system screen. Patricia, he said. Richard. Dr. Warren's voice was even. I've placed a temporary hold on the diuretic agent for the patient in 114 pending case review this evening. Her numbers have shifted since this morning, and I want the full team looking at it. Dr. Holt was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I reinstated that medication based on the clinical presentation. I'm not disputing your reasoning. I'm requesting a case review. She said it without moving, without apology, without the softening language that made difficult things easier to deflect. I've reached out to Dr. Chu and Dr. Reyes. 5 o'clock in the conference room. I'd like you to be there. Another 3 seconds. Of course. He walked away. Daniel looked at Dr. Warren. Thank you. Let's see what the review shows, she said. I'm not making any determinations yet. I'm just making sure the right people are in the room. He nodded. He thought about the right people being in the room. He thought about who had been in the room 2 nights ago when the right thing had happened, and who had been quietly making sure the right things kept happening since then, and where that person was right now. Is Emily Carter still in the building? He said. She went home after her shift. He went back to his mother. The case review began at 5:03 and went until 6:47. Daniel was not in the room. He had not been invited, and he had not pushed for an invitation because Emily had taught him something about which battles to fight and when, and he understood that this one needed to happen without him in it. He sat outside room 114 and he let the doctors do what doctors needed to do. He called his company's head of operations at 5:30 and said that he was extending his leave of absence and that she had full authority to manage whatever needed managing. She said the words he paid her to say, which were that it was fine and they had it covered. He thanked her and hung up and did not think about it again. He called his mother's neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who was 74 years old and had been checking on Margaret's house every day since the hospitalization, and who told Daniel in great detail about how she had watered the plants and collected the mail, and that the tomato plants on the back porch were going to need attention soon because Margaret had planted them in March and they were starting to come in. He thanked her. He almost cried standing in the hallway, listening to a 74-year-old woman describe his mother's tomato plants, because it was such a specific and ordinary piece of his mother's life continuing to exist outside the hospital. He collected himself. At 6:50, Dr. Warren came out of the conference room. He stood up. The case review is complete, she said. The team is in agreement that the reinstated medication was contributing to the decline in your mother's numbers this afternoon. The hold will remain in place. We're adjusting the fluid management approach to address the retention issue through alternative means that don't reintroduce the interaction risk. And her prognosis. With the adjusted protocol and close monitoring, we believe her baseline can restabilize. The next 48 hours are important. But the trajectory we were concerned about this afternoon, we believe we've interrupted it. She paused. She's responding to the hold already. Her numbers from the last hour are moving in the right direction. Daniel exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the exhale of someone who had been holding a specific breath since 2 o'clock that afternoon and was now releasing it very carefully, because releasing it entirely felt premature. "Dr. Holt," he said. Dr. Warren looked at him steadily. "The case review findings will be documented. There will be a quality review process." She said it with the careful precision of someone who was telling him everything she could tell him. "I can't speak to specifics beyond that. Is he still my mother's attending physician?" A pause. "The attending of record will be reviewed as part of the overall case assessment. I'll let you know." He understood what she was not saying. "Thank you, Dr. Warren. Your mother is strong," she said, "and she's had people paying very close attention to her." She looked at him. "Make sure the right people know that." She walked back down the corridor. Daniel stood outside room 114, and he thought about the last 72 hours, about what Emily Carter had set in motion 2 nights ago at 1 in the morning, with an hour spent reading a chart, and how that single act of refusing to accept incomplete information had produced a cascade of interventions that had caught the same problem 3 times in 3 different forms, each time preventing something worse from happening. He thought about how none of those interventions would have occurred if she had done what every institutional pressure around her was designed to encourage her to do, which was to stay in her lane. He went in to see his mother. Margaret was awake, watching the door like she had been listening for footsteps. "Well," she said, "the review is done. They're adjusting your protocol. Your numbers are already improving." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was something resolute in them. "I want you to do something for me." "Name it." "I want you to make sure Emily doesn't lose her job because of what she did for me." He looked at her. "I'm working on that. Work harder." Her voice had more edge in it than he'd heard since she woke up. "I know what this hospital is like. I know what they do to people who speak up. I spent 11 years in a building like this one, and I watched it happen to people who deserved better." She looked at him directly. "Emily Carter saved my life twice, and she's going to walk back through that door tonight and go back to work like nothing happened. And when nobody is watching, this place is going to find a way to make her pay for it. I know it, you know it, and I want you to stop it." "I will." "Not eventually. Now." Her eyes were sharp. "You have money, and you have influence, and you have a story that the public would be very interested in hearing. Use it. But use it carefully, because if you use it wrong, you make her a martyr and a target, and you end her career instead of protecting it." Daniel stared at her. "Mom, I haven't been this sick that I can't see what's happening around me. I had 11 years to learn how institutions protect themselves." She settled back slightly. "Promise me." "I promise." She nodded once, closed her eyes. "Now go eat something. The real kind." He stayed until she was asleep. Then he went out to the hallway and he made a phone call. Not to his company. Not to his lawyer, though his lawyer would be next. He called a journalist, a specific journalist, a woman named Dana Kowalski, who wrote for a regional health publication, and whom he had met twice at industry conferences, and who had a reputation for the kind of careful, specific reporting that didn't sensationalize things, but also didn't soft-pedal them. He told Dana Kowalski that he had a story she might be interested in. He told her it involved medical oversight, institutional accountability, and the specific mechanics of what happened to healthcare workers who advocated too effectively for their patients. He told her he wasn't ready to speak on record yet, but he wanted her to be aware of the story. She said she was aware of a lot of stories and asked him what made this one different. He thought about the answer. "The person at the center of it," he said. "She's the kind of person that makes you understand why any of this matters." Dana Kowalski said she would like to hear more. He said he would be in touch. He hung up and went back to his mother's bedside. Emily arrived for her shift at 7 that evening and understood immediately that something had happened. She could read units the way she read charts, by what the numbers weren't telling her, by the texture of silences, by the way people moved. The day shift nurses were quieter than usual. The charge nurse gave her a look that contained several things stacked on top of each other. The medication board for room 114 had been updated, and the agent she had twice flagged was no longer on it. She went to the charge nurse. "Fill me in." The charge nurse, a woman named Rosa, who had worked this unit for 11 years and who Emily trusted completely, pulled her aside. "Case review this afternoon," Warren called it. Holt was there. Reyes Chu on the phone. They held the medication. "His numbers on Whitmore have been under review since 2 o'clock. She paused. "Word is he won't be the attending of record for much longer." Emily absorbed this. Margaret's condition. "Improving. Stable going into tonight." Rosa looked at her. "Nice work." Dr. Warren called the review. "Because someone handed her the information that made the review necessary." Rosa looked at her directly. "I know you know how this works, Em. People know. Not everybody's going to say it out loud, but people know." Emily nodded. She went to the nurse's station. She started her rounds. She was checking the chart for room 108 when Daniel appeared at the station. She looked up. "Your mother's numbers," she said immediately. "I saw the update." "She's better." He was looking at her with that focused attention she had noticed from the first night, the quality of a man who was used to assessing situations and had turned that capacity fully toward her. "Are you aware of what happened this afternoon?" "I was briefed when I came in." Dr. Warren placed the hold. "The case review team agreed with the concern you raised." Dr. Warren made a good call. "Emily, stop deflecting for 1 minute." She looked at him. He came to stand closer to the station, low enough that the conversation was not for general consumption. "My mother asked me to make sure you don't lose your job." She was quiet. "I told her I would take care of it. I want you to know that I'm taking it seriously. I've made some calls today. I'm not going to do anything that puts you in a more difficult position. I understand what you told me this morning about how that works, but I need you to know that someone outside this building is paying attention now, and that matters." She looked at him for a long moment. "What kind of calls?" "The kind that establish a record outside of this institution's control. Nothing published, nothing public yet. Just a record that exists somewhere other than inside these walls." She thought about Carolyn Marsh's office. She thought about the motivational poster. She thought about the word "yet" in his sentence. "That's careful," she said. "You told me to wait and be careful. I was trying to follow instructions." For the first time since they'd met, she almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh. She had been so tightly managed for the last 48 hours that the feeling of something loosening in her chest was unfamiliar and slightly disorienting. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she had promised herself a long time ago to be honest about things, even when honesty was uncomfortable. "I didn't do this expecting protection. I did it because it was right." "I know that. But I would be lying if I told you that knowing someone outside of this building is paying attention doesn't matter to me." "It matters." She looked at her chart, then back at him. "Don't let them use me to change the story. Whatever you do, don't let the narrative become about me instead of about the system that made this possible." He looked at her with something in his expression that she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't sympathy. It was closer to the expression of someone who has just been handed a clearer version of something they had been trying to understand. "The system," he said. "Dr. Holt isn't the problem. He's an expression of the problem. The problem is a structure that allowed a patient's medication history to exist in two separate systems that don't communicate. The problem is a culture where a nurse who identifies a clinical concern has to go through 4 levels of institutional anxiety before that concern gets addressed. The problem is that this happened to your mother, who has a son who owns a company and can make phone calls, and it could just as easily happen to someone whose family has no resources and no recourse." She stopped. "If you want to do something about that. Not about me. Not about Dr. Holt specifically. About the system." He was looking at her the way her brother sometimes looked at her when she said something he needed to sit with. "That's a bigger project," he said. "Yes." "Are you available to consult?" She blinked. He said it so directly and seriously that it took her a moment to process it as a genuine question. "I'm a nurse. I work night shifts. I know what you are. I'm asking if you would be willing to talk to some people, policy people, healthcare consultants, people who work on exactly these kinds of system failures, and tell them what you told me." He paused. "Not now. Not this week. When things are more stable. When my mother is home, and you have time to think about it without being exhausted." She looked at him. She was trying to find the part of this that was a rich man buying his way to feeling better about something, and she couldn't quite find it. What she found instead was someone who had sat beside his mother for 3 days and had watched a system nearly fail her in slow motion, and who was now trying to convert his anger about that into something that would prevent it from happening to the next person. That she recognized. She recognized it because it was exactly what she had been trying to do with every shift she worked. "Maybe," she said. "I'll take maybe." She picked up the chart for room 111. "I need to do my rounds." "Go." He stepped back. Then, "She asked about you before she fell asleep." "What did she say?" "She said you remind her of herself at your age." He paused. She meant it as the highest compliment she knows how to give someone. Emily stood with the chart in her hands and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for immediately. It was somewhere between grief and gratitude, and it had something to do with her grandmother, and something to do with the last 2 years of working nights alone in a town she hadn't chosen, and something to do with the very strange experience of being seen clearly by someone you had not expected to see you at all. "Tell her I said thank you," Emily said. She went to room 111. She sat with the woman in room 111 who hadn't had visitors in 3 days, and she listened to her talk about her daughter in Denver, and her husband who had died 6 years ago, and the garden she was planning to put in when she got home, and she gave the woman the thing that room 111 needed, which was not medication or procedure, but simple, undivided attention. Then she went to room 116, and she pushed back quietly and specifically on the pain management inadequacy she had flagged twice before, and this time she used language that left no room for dismissal, and the resident on call authorized the adjustment without argument. Then she went to room 108, and she talked a post-surgical patient through a panic response that nobody else had identified as a panic response, because it was presenting as respiratory complaint, and she sat with him until his breathing slowed and his shoulders came down from around his ears. Then she went back to room 114. Margaret was sleeping, but lighter than before, the quality of sleep that is close to the surface and knows someone is in the room. Her vitals were good. Her cardiac rhythm on the monitor showed the stabilized pattern that Emily had been hoping to see since the night she had first looked at the chart. Emily stood beside the bed for a moment. She did not touch the chart. She did not need to. She just stood there and looked at this woman who had somehow, in the middle of her own crisis, managed to look back at Emily with enough clarity to see what Emily had needed to hear. "You remind me of myself at your age." Emily knew she was going to carry that sentence for a long time. She checked the monitor one more time, recorded her observations, stepped quietly out of the room. In the hallway, she paused. Down the corridor, she could see Daniel Whitmore through the window of the family waiting room. He was on the phone, walking slowly back and forth the way people walked when they were in a conversation that required their full attention. He was someone who had walked into this hospital 4 days ago with every resource available to him and had needed a young nurse in worn shoes to show him something that money could not buy. She understood him better than she'd expected to. She understood the particular blindness that came from living inside systems that worked for you the way you stopped seeing the machinery because the machinery kept producing results. She had not come from systems like that, and so she had always been able to see the machinery. It was both a gift and a significant personal cost. But tonight, the machinery had been interrupted, twice, and the interruptions had held. Her phone buzzed. An alert from room 108, the post-surgical patient's heart rate had spiked slightly. She moved. She was already walking when she heard from behind her, Daniel's voice not directed at her continuing his phone call. "Say clearly, I want it to be about the patients. That's the whole point. The nurse's name matters only if we can protect her. She did not stop walking, but she registered it, and for the first time in 2 days, something that had been wound very tight inside her chest released by one careful degree. She went to room 108. She sat with her patient. She did her job. Outside, the night was clear and cold, the first clear night since the rain had stopped, and Silver Creek was quiet in the way of small towns at 9 in the evening. The kind of quiet that felt like something resuming after an interruption rather than something ending. Inside room 114, Margaret Whitmore's heart held its new steadier rhythm. And on the third floor, a nurse who had refused to stop looking was still looking, still catching, still carrying the weight of everyone else's well-being with the same bone-deep stubbornness that she had learned from a woman who had once held 3 jobs and never complained, and that she had carried every night since in worn shoes on hospital floors that nobody noticed, doing work that would never be on a plaque, saving people who would never know her name. The formal reprimand arrived on a Tuesday. Emily found the envelope in her locker at the start of her shift, a sealed white envelope with the hospital's administrative letterhead in the upper left corner, and her name typed on the front with the specific impersonality of official correspondence. She stood at her locker for a moment with the envelope in her hand, feeling its weight, knowing what it was before she opened it. She opened it. It was 2 pages. The language was careful. Clinical in the way that administrative language is clinical, precise, drained of warmth, constructed to describe human events in terms that made them sound like mechanical failures rather than choices made by people about other people. It cited 2 incidents of what the document called unsanctioned clinical intervention and unauthorized communication with specialist consultants and family members outside the established chain of nursing authority. It noted that these incidents had been reviewed by the Director of Nursing and the Department Medical Director and had been found to constitute a pattern warranting formal corrective action. It was not a termination notice. It was one step before a termination notice. Emily read it twice, folded it, put it in her bag, clipped her badge to her scrub pocket, went to the nurse's station and picked up her first chart of the night. Rosa was watching her from across the station. I'm fine. What did it say? Formal corrective action. Pattern of scope deviation. 2 documented incidents. Rosa's expression did something complicated and quickly controlled. They moved fast. They always move fast when they've decided. Emily pulled up the vitals for room 108. How's Mr. Patterson doing? Emily, you can't just... Rosa, I need to do my job. Okay, I need to just work right now. She looked up from the chart and met the other woman's eyes, and what Rosa saw there made her stop pushing. I will figure out what to do about the letter, but right now I need to focus on my patients. Rosa nodded. Okay. Emily went to room 108. She spent 11 minutes with Mr. Patterson, who was 3 days post-surgical and whose anxiety was expressing itself as physical complaints that the day team kept addressing pharmacologically rather than conversationally. She sat with him. She talked to him about his wife who was coming tomorrow and about his son who was flying in from Atlanta and about the specific fear of hospital rooms that had nothing to do with the procedure and everything to do with the feeling of being reduced to a body in a bed without agency. By the time she left, his respiration rate had dropped 4 points. She went to room 111. She went to room 103. She went to room 114. Margaret was awake. She had been making steady progress for 2 days, the kind of progress that was not dramatic enough for headlines, but was deeply significant to anyone who had seen where her numbers had been 72 hours ago. She was sitting up slightly in the bed when Emily came in, and she looked at Emily with the immediate attentive focus of someone who has become very good at reading the people who walk through their door. Sit down, Margaret said. I'm just here to check your vitals. Emily, sit down. Something in the older woman's voice was different. It had the specific weight of a person who has decided to stop waiting for the right moment and has determined that this moment will have to do. Emily sat. Tell me what happened, Margaret said. Emily kept her expression neutral. Your cardiac output numbers this evening are... I'm not asking about my numbers. I'm asking about you. Margaret looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention she had. You came through that door differently than you came through it last night. Something happened. The envelope was in Emily's bag 200 feet away in the locker room. There was some administrative correspondence today, Emily said carefully. Formal. It was not a question. Emily looked at her. Yes. Margaret was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The IV dripped. How bad? One step before termination. It can be appealed. Have you told Daniel? No, and I'm not going to. Not yet. Emily. Mrs. Whitmore. Emily said it gently but clearly. With respect, this is my situation to manage. I appreciate what your son is trying to do. But if I run to him every time this institution makes a move, I become someone who needs rescuing. And I can't do my job if that's what I become. She looked at the older woman. I need you to understand that. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Her expression had the quality of someone who was deciding whether to argue and deciding against it, not because she agreed, but because she recognized that this was one of those situations where the wrong kind of help was worse than no help at all. All right, she said, but I want you to know something. Okay, my son is not trying to rescue you. He is trying to do something useful with the fact that you changed the direction of what was happening to me. There's a difference. She paused. He's not a perfect man. He spent a lot of years using money as a substitute for being present, and it's going to take him a while to fully understand the difference between those two things. But he is learning. She met Emily's eyes. Don't make him irrelevant before he gets the chance to learn. Emily thought about that. She turned it over. She had a particular habit of examining things from multiple angles before she responded, which was part of why people sometimes mistook her silence for resistance when it was actually just thoroughness. I won't do anything about the letter tonight, she said finally. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. Margaret settled back. Now check my vitals so you can tell me I'm improving. Emily checked them. She was. She wrote it down. She stood to leave. Emily. She turned. Margaret was looking at her with an expression Emily had trouble categorizing. It was not pity. It was not the fond concern of an older woman for a younger one, though it had elements of that. It was something more specific, more personal, like recognition. You carry too much alone, Margaret said. I know because I did the same thing for most of my life, and it cost me more than I understood at the time. A pause. It doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you tired. Emily stood with her hand on the door frame. Get some rest between checks, Margaret said. You look like you need it. Emily left. She did not cry. She was not someone who cried easily, and even if she were, she was at work, and work required a certain containment. But she walked back to the nurse's station with something moving through her chest, that she had to breathe carefully around something that was partly the exhaustion of 2 days of sustained alertness, and partly the very specific vulnerability of being seen by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. She sat down. She picked up the next chart. She worked. Sawed. Daniel found out about the letter at 10:47 that night. Not from Emily. From Rosa, who had worked this unit for 11 years and who had watched 3 good nurses leave under circumstances that she had never been able to say aloud to anyone who could do anything about it, and who had decided standing at the nurses' station, watching Emily move through her rounds with 2 pages of institutional consequence folded in her bag, that she was not going to watch it happen a 4th time without doing something. She had found Daniel in the family waiting room. She had introduced herself. She had said very quietly and very quickly, Your mother's nurse received a formal corrective action letter today. Before this goes further, someone outside this building needs to know. Then she had gone back to work, because she had done what she could do, and the rest was not hers to manage. Daniel had been very still for the 30 seconds after Rosa walked away. Then he had called his lawyer. His lawyer was a woman named Catherine Park, who had worked with him for 9 years, and who had the specific talent of being able to assess a situation's legal and strategic dimensions simultaneously, without getting them confused with each other. He told her what Rosa had told him. He told her everything he knew about the last 4 days. He told her about the medication interaction and the case review, and the hold that had been placed twice on the same medication, and the attending physician who had reinstated it after the first hold. Catherine Park listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Do you have documentation?" "Emily does. She said she documented everything contemporaneously. She's smart." A pause. "Daniel, this is a retaliation case. It's not subtle. A nurse identifies a clinical concern. The concern is validated by a case review that effectively finds fault with the attending physician's decisions, and within 48 hours the nurse receives formal corrective action. The timeline is the problem for them. Can we stop it? We can do more than stop it, but it depends on what Emily wants. She's the one who has standing here, not you. She said she doesn't want to be the story. She may not have a choice about being the story, but she can control what the story says." Catherine paused again. "Get me everything you have. I'll start building the record tonight. And Daniel, don't do anything public yet. Let me work first." He said he understood. He hung up. He sat in the family waiting room for several minutes, thinking about what it meant that Emily had found that letter and gone straight to work and hadn't said a word. He thought about what it cost a person to absorb something like that and keep moving. He thought about his mother saying, "You carry too much alone," and understanding that she had said it to him about himself as much as she had said it to Emily about Emily. He went to find Emily. She was at the nurse's station writing notes. She looked up when he approached. She saw his face. "Rosa told you," she said. "He didn't apologize for knowing." "Yes." She nodded slowly, set down her pen. "I was going to tell you. I just needed tonight to think." "Okay." She looked at him. "How much do you know?" "Everything you told me. Everything that's happened in the last 4 days. I've talked to my lawyer." She was quiet. He expected resistance. He expected the careful self-sufficiency she deployed like armor. Instead, she was quiet in a way that felt like something underneath that armor had shifted. "What did she say?" Emily asked. "She said it's a retaliation case. She said the timeline is their problem. She said she can build a record, but it depends on what you want." Emily looked at the nurse's station, at the charts, at the monitor screens showing the vitals of the people she was responsible for tonight. She looked at all of it, and then she looked at Daniel. "I want to keep my job," she said. "Not because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't, because the people on this floor need someone who pays attention, and I pay attention, and if I'm not here, then I don't know who does." She paused. "I also I need it to not just be about me. If what happened to my mother is going to mean something, it has to change something, for other patients, for other nurses in situations like mine." "That's what I told my lawyer." She looked at him. "You already said that to her." "Before you said it to me, because I knew that was what you'd want." She held his gaze for a moment with an expression he was beginning to understand was what Emily Carter looked like when something surprised her in a way she hadn't prepared for. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay. Okay. Let your lawyer build the record. I'll give her everything I have, all my documentation." She picked up her pen. "But Daniel." "Yeah. The second this becomes about punishing Dr. Holt specifically, I'm out. I'm not interested in destroying a person. I'm interested in fixing a system." "Understood." "I mean it." "I know you mean it." She held his gaze one more second. Then she went back to her notes. "Your mother's numbers at 9 were the best they've been since admission. Go tell her that. She's been pretending to sleep for the last hour waiting for you." He almost smiled. "How do you know she's pretending?" "Because when your mother is actually asleep, she breathes differently than when she's listening for footsteps in the hallway." She didn't look up from her notes. "She's listening for you." He went to his mother. Bet. Margaret was not pretending to sleep. She was awake and upright and had clearly been waiting because she looked at him when he came through the door with the immediate focused attention of someone who has been holding a question ready. "Well," she said, "Emily knows I know. She's going to work with Catherine." Margaret exhaled. Not dramatically, just a small release of held breath. Good. You knew about the letter before I did. She told me, earlier tonight. Margaret looked at him. She told me, and then she asked me not to tell you. I didn't tell you. Rosa did. I know. Don't be angry with Rosa. She's been watching this happen to good people for years, and she's sick of it. I'm not angry with Rosa. He sat down, took his mother's hand. I'm angry with a system that looked at what Emily did and decided the appropriate response was a formal reprimand. I know. She squeezed his hand. Channel it. I am. No, you're collecting it. She looked at him with the specific look she had been giving him since he was a teenager, the one that meant she could see the difference between what he was doing and what he needed to be doing. Collecting anger and channeling it are not the same thing. I've watched you collect things your whole life. Achievements, resources, grievances. You build them up and you hold them and you use them very strategically when the right moment arrives. She paused. That's good in business. In life it just means you're always carrying something. He looked at her. When did you become a philosopher? About 40 years ago, when I realized I was raising a child alone, and I could either be angry about everything that wasn't fair, or I could use the energy to actually do something. She shifted slightly in the bed. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Okay? When you first walked into this hospital, what did you think was going to happen? He thought about the honest answer. I thought I was going to bring in the right people and the right resources and fix it. And when the right people and the right resources weren't enough. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know what to do. For the first time in a long time, I genuinely didn't know what to do. Margaret nodded. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in years. He looked at her sharply. She met his eyes without flinching. I love you, she said. You know that, and you have become someone genuinely remarkable. But somewhere along the way, you started believing that if you brought enough resources to bear on a problem, it would resolve. That the right combination of money and strategy and the correct people would produce the correct outcome. She paused. And then you came here and the problem wasn't strategic. It was human. It required someone to simply care enough to look one more time. And you didn't have a resource for that. He sat with this for a moment, turned it over. You're right. I know I'm right. I am your mother. The corner of her mouth moved. Emily has something you've spent 20 years optimizing yourself away from. She has it completely naturally without trying. She notices people, not their utility or their position or what they can do for her. She notices them as people. Margaret looked at him. That's the thing you keep trying to repay, and you can't repay it because it isn't transactional. It was never transactional. That's the whole point of it. Then what do I do with it? You learn from it. She looked at him directly. You take what watching Emily do her job has shown you about what actually matters, and you build something from it. Not for her. Not as a debt payment. For everyone who will ever be in a bed like this one, and needs someone to look one more time. She settled back. That's what you do with it. He sat in the quiet of room 114 for a long time after she stopped speaking. He sat there while the monitor beeped and the IV dripped and the night shift sounds of the hospital moved around them, and he thought about what his mother had just said with the same focused attention he usually reserved for board meetings and quarterly projections. She was right. He had known she was right before she finished the sentence. He had known it with the particular speed of recognition that came from hearing someone articulate something you had been trying to understand about yourself for a long time without having the right language for it. He had spent 20 years optimizing himself away from exactly the quality that had saved his mother's life, and he had needed to come back to Silver Creek, to this hospital, to a night shift nurse in worn shoes, to understand that. I need to make some calls, he said. I know. She waved him toward the door. Go. Come back in the morning. Bring something from the diner, not the cafeteria, the diner. The Green Sign Diner. You're learning. He stopped at the door. Mom. She looked at him. I'm sorry. For the years I substituted resources for presence. He said it plainly, without the qualifications that his business instincts wanted to attach to it. I'm going to do better. Margaret Whitmore looked at her son for a long moment. She had been waiting for those words, or some version of them, for longer than she would ever tell him. I know you are, she said. Now go make your calls. The calls Daniel made that night were not the calls anyone at Silver Creek Memorial Hospital would have expected. He did not call Dana Kowalski, the journalist. Not yet. He called Catherine Park and gave her Emily's contact information and everything he knew about the documentation Emily had kept. He called 3 people on the boards of regional healthcare organizations, contacts he had accumulated over years of technology work adjacent to health systems, and he had the kind of careful, specific conversations that planted seeds without demanding immediate fruit. He called a healthcare policy consultant he had met at a conference 2 years ago and had stayed in contact with specifically because the man's work on institutional safety culture had struck him as important in a way he hadn't fully understood at the time. He was beginning to understand it now. He did not sleep. He sat in the family waiting room and he worked through the problem, the way he worked through any complex problem, by identifying the system behind the individual event, mapping its pressure points and thinking carefully about where and how to apply force to produce change rather than just reaction. Emily had told him, don't let it be about me. Don't make it about punishing a person. Make it about fixing a system. He was going to try. At 2 a.m, he walked down to the nurse's station. Emily was there writing. She looked up. You're still here, she said. I've been working. She looked at him with a slightly different expression than usual, assessing. What kind of working? The kind that doesn't blow anything up. The kind that builds something. She held his gaze for a moment. Okay. He sat down across the station from her. Can I ask you something? You're going to ask it regardless. If you could change one thing about how this hospital operates, one structural thing, not a person, a structure, what would it be? She didn't hesitate. The record systems. Make patient records unified across primary care and hospital systems. If a patient's complete medication history existed in one place, that every treating provider could access the interaction I found would have been visible on admission. She paused. Your mother would not have spent 4 days in a dangerous protocol. The whole thing would have been different. That's a technology problem. Partly. It's also a priority problem. The technology exists. It's not being implemented because integration is expensive and politically complicated, and nobody has made it non-negotiable. She looked at him. You know people who could make it non-negotiable? He looked at her. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about it for 6 years. Every time I see a patient whose records are scattered across 4 different systems. She said it without heat. Just factually. The way she said most things. The medication interaction I found, it's not unusual. It's the kind of thing that happens to patients who have been treated in multiple places and whose providers don't have a complete picture. It happens less dramatically than it happened to your mother usually, but it happens. How often? Often enough that I stopped being surprised by it and started being angry about it. She looked at her chart, which is when you know something has become a systemic problem rather than an individual one. Daniel sat with that. He thought about the specific nature of systemic problems, how they became invisible through normalization, how the people most harmed by them were often the least equipped to address them, how change in systems required someone with enough standing outside the system to make the cost of inaction higher than the cost of change. He had that standing. He had never thought of it as a responsibility before. He was beginning to. If I told you I was going to put significant resources toward a health records integration initiative in Oregon, starting with this region, he said, what would you tell me? Emily was quiet for a moment. I would tell you to talk to the nurses first, not just the administrators, not just the physicians, the nurses. Because the nurses are the ones who see where the gaps are every single day, and nobody ever asks them. Would you be willing to be part of that conversation, formally, as a consultant? She looked at him. She had that careful assessing quality she always had when she was deciding how much of herself to put forward. What does that mean formally? It means I would like to hire you, in whatever capacity makes sense and on whatever schedule works around your shifts, to help design an approach to this problem that actually addresses the things that nurses see. Because if I build a system without that input, I'm going to build something that works on paper and fails in practice, and I've spent enough years building things that fail in practice to know I don't want to do it again. Emily put her pen down. She looked at the nurse's station, at the monitors at the hallway she had been walking for 2 years. She thought about Nathan at home. She thought about the rent that was always 3 weeks from difficult. She thought about the way she had moved to Silver Creek and narrowed her entire life to a radius that was 10 minutes from her brother's apartment, and asked herself every 6 months whether this was sustainable, and told herself every 6 months that it was fine. What would that pay? She said. It was a direct question. She had learned that direct questions about money were not undignified. They were practical. She had learned this from years of not asking, and then having to manage the consequences of not asking. He told her a number. She kept her expression neutral, with the specific effort of a person who was not going to let him see what that number meant to her. That's consulting rates, he said. Not charity. You would be doing actual work. I know the difference, she said. Do you want to think about it? Yes. She picked up her pen. I want to think about it. Okay. She started writing again. Then she stopped. Daniel. He looked up. Nathan has a follow-up appointment on Friday with his physical therapist. He's been on a wait list for 6 weeks for a specialized therapy program that his current coverage doesn't fully fund. She said it without looking at him. I'm not asking you to... What's the program? She told him. She gave him the name and the facility and the specific component that the coverage didn't include, and she said it with the same factual precision. She gave everything without making it smaller than it was or larger than it was. He wrote it down. She watched him write it down. That's separate from the consulting, he said. That's just me being a person. She was quiet for a long moment. Margaret's voice was in her head, letting people help you. Doesn't make you weak. It means you are human. And she thought about all the years she had carried everything herself, and how much of that had been genuine independence, and how much had been fear of exactly this moment when someone offered, and she had to decide whether to let them. Okay, she said quietly. He nodded. He put the notebook away. He stood up. I'm going to try to sleep for a few hours. I'll be back at 7. I'll be here until 6. He started down the hallway, stopped, turned back. Emily. She looked up. When my mother asked me what I would do without the procedure, I told her I would fight. He paused. But I was thinking about resources. I was thinking about money and specialists and the right phone calls. I wasn't thinking about the right person. He looked at her steadily. You were the right person. You walked into that hallway with nothing except what you knew and what you were willing to risk, and that was enough. That was more than everything else I brought to this. He paused again. I don't know how to repay that, and I've been trying to figure out how to tell you that without making it sound like I'm attempting to buy my way out of gratitude. But I needed to say it. Emily held his gaze. She thought about all the nights she had walked these floors alone. All the times she had identified something and had to fight the entire weight of the institution to be heard. All the patients she had gone home worrying about because she was not sure the concern she'd raised was going to be followed through on. She thought about how lonely that was. How specifically and particularly lonely. Not the loneliness of being without people, but the loneliness of being in a room full of people and being the only one who could see a specific thing that mattered. You don't owe me anything, she said, but I'm glad you're going to do something useful with it. He nodded once. Went down the hallway. Emily watched him go. She turned back to her notes. An hour later, she went to check on Margaret. The older woman was awake, barely surface-level sleep that came apart easily. She opened her eyes when Emily checked the monitor. "His calls," Margaret said. Her voice was soft with sleep, but her mind was sharp. "Did he tell you what they were about? Some of it? Good ones, I hope." Emily looked at the monitor, looked at the numbers, looked at Margaret Whitmore's face, which was more alive than it had been 4 days ago. More color, more presence, more of the particular force that her son had described, and that Emily had now seen enough of to understand was simply who this woman was. "Good ones," Emily said. Margaret closed her eyes. "He's learning." Emily wrote down the vitals. She went to the door. "Emily," she paused. "My tomato plants." Margaret's eyes were still closed. "My neighbor Mrs. Peterson is checking on them, but they need to be staked. The cages. I put the cages in the garage in October, and I'll tell Daniel. He doesn't know anything about tomatoes. I'll tell Mrs. Peterson." A soft exhale, almost a laugh. "Thank you." Emily went back to the nurse's station. She sat down. She put her hand in her bag and felt the folded envelope without taking it out. She thought about 2 pages of institutional language that described the last 4 days in terms that bore no relationship to what had actually happened. She thought about Catherine Park building a record. She thought about Daniel's calls. She thought about Nathan's therapy program and the number that had been written down in a notebook. She thought about Margaret Whitmore's tomatoes, which needed to be staked because she had planted them in March and they were coming in and she was going to go home and tend them. The monitor screens glowed. The hallway was quiet. The night held the particular stillness of a hospital at 3 in the morning when the world outside had gone to sleep and the people inside were managing the ongoing fragile business of staying alive. Emily Carter picked up the next chart. She kept working. Catherine Park moved fast. That was the thing about Catherine. She had spent 9 years working with Daniel Whitmore, and she had learned that the window between an institutional decision and its consequences was always shorter than people assumed, which meant that if you were going to build a record, you built it immediately and completely, and you did not wait for the situation to clarify, because by the time the situation clarified, the damage was already done. She called Emily on Wednesday morning, 6 hours after Daniel had given her the contact information at the precise hour she had calculated Emily would be home from her night shift and not yet asleep. She had calculated correctly. Emily answered on the second ring. "Emily Carter, I'm Catherine Park. I work with Daniel Whitmore. I'd like to talk with you about the corrective action letter you received yesterday if you're willing." There was a brief silence on the line. "He told you about that quickly." "He told me last night. I've been working since then." Catherine's voice was efficient without being cold. She had the quality of someone who respected other people's time because she valued her own. "I want to be clear about what I'm offering before we go further. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to make sure you understand what your options are and what the legal and professional dimensions of your situation look like. After that, every decision is yours." Another silence, shorter this time. "Okay, go ahead." Catherine went ahead. She talked for 18 minutes. She laid out the timeline. The medication identification, the case review, the hold and reinstatement, the case review outcome. The corrective action letter arriving 46 hours after a review that had effectively validated Emily's concerns. She used the word retaliation twice. Not as an accusation, but as a legal category with specific criteria, and she walked Emily through how the timeline mapped to those criteria with the methodical precision of someone building an argument from the ground up. Emily listened without interrupting. When Catherine finished, Emily said, "What do you need from me?" "Your documentation. Everything you recorded contemporaneously timestamps, notes the specific language you used when you raised the concerns, and to whom." A pause. "You said you documented everything. How complete is it?" "Complete," Emily said. "I've been doing this for 6 years. I know what documentation looks like when it's going to matter later." Catherine was quiet for a half-second. The half-second of someone revising their estimate of what they were dealing with upward. "Can you send me copies today?" "I can send them within the hour." "Perfect." Another pause. Emily, I want to ask you something directly. All right. What outcome do you actually want from this? Not what's legally achievable, not what Daniel wants. What do you want? Emily was standing in her apartment. She had not yet changed out of her scrubs. She had made coffee and not drunk it, and it was sitting on the counter getting cold. She looked at the window at the morning light coming through it at the specific quality of Silver Creek at 7 in the morning when the town was waking up and she was just coming home. I want to keep my job, she said. I want the corrective action removed from my file. I want some kind of structural acknowledgement that what happened to Margaret Whitmore, the records gap, the medication interaction that should have been caught on admission, is a system failure, not a nursing failure. And I want it to be harder for this to happen to the next nurse who raises a concern like mine. She paused. That's what I want. Catherine said, that's very achievable. Emily drank the cold coffee. Then let's do it. She sent the documentation within 40 minutes. It was thorough. It was time-stamped. It was exactly what she had told Daniel it would be, a complete record assembled by someone who had understood from the beginning that the truth only protected you if you could prove it existed. Catherine called Daniel at 9:15. Her documentation is airtight, she said. We have a strong position. I want to approach the hospital's legal counsel directly, not the administration, and I want to do it before they build any more paper around the corrective action, today if possible. Do it, Daniel said. I'll also need you to be prepared to be public if they don't move quickly enough. Not aggressive, just visible. I'm prepared. And Daniel, she paused. The journalist you mentioned. Hold her for now, but keep her warm. We may need her if this stalls. He called Dana Kowalski and told her to stay available. She said she was always available for a story worth running. He said he hoped she wouldn't need to run it. She said in her experience that was never how it worked. He said he was starting to understand that. The hospital's legal counsel called Catherine back at 2:15 that same afternoon. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Catherine called Daniel immediately after. They want to meet, tomorrow morning. Hospital administrator, legal counsel, director of nursing. That was fast. The timeline scared them. They know what it looks like. A brief pause. They're going to try to frame this as a misunderstanding in the corrective action process. A procedural error. They'll want to rescind quietly and move on. And Emily's other conditions. That's where tomorrow gets interesting. Catherine's voice had the specific tone of a lawyer who was looking forward to a meeting. I'm going to need Emily there. Not to speak necessarily, I'll do the talking. But I want them to look at her when we discuss what this hospital almost cost its patients. He called Emily. She was awake. She had slept 4 hours and come back up, which was the specific insomnia of someone whose mind would not stay quiet. She listened to what Daniel told her about the meeting. She was quiet for a moment. What time? She said. 9 in the morning. I have a shift at 7 tonight. I'll be coming off at 6. I know. You don't have to. I'll be there at 9. She paused. Daniel, if they rescind the letter and that's where it stops, if they just want to make this go away quietly, that's not enough. I know. I need you to hold the line on the structural piece, the record systems. Some kind of formal review of how concerns raised by nursing staff are documented and addressed. If they think a quiet rescission settles this, they're wrong. Catherine will hold the line. Make sure you do too, in that room. She said it without apology, without softening. You have more standing in that room than anyone else. Use it. He said he would. He sat with his mother for the rest of the afternoon. Margaret had been moved from the ICU monitoring room to a step-down room that morning, a meaningful transition, the kind that nurses celebrated quietly because it represented a specific threshold crossed. She was in a regular hospital bed now. She was sitting up without assistance. She had eaten lunch, actually eaten it, and had opinions about the quality of the soup that she expressed at some length. She was, in other words, becoming herself again. Tell me about tomorrow, she said when Daniel had finished the account of Catherine's calls. He told her. She listened the way she always listened, which was completely without interrupting, absorbing everything before she said anything. "Good," she said when he finished. "That's all you have to say. What else is there to say? The right people are in the right positions. Emily is going to be in that room." She looked at him. "You know what I want to know." "What? What are you going to do after?" "Not the record systems, I understand that piece. What are you going to do about being here?" She met his eyes. Silver Creek, Oregon. Being present, not managing presence from a distance. He looked at his mother. He thought about the automatic payment transfers and the Sunday calls and the 14 unread messages from the legal team that he still hadn't fully processed. He thought about Mrs. Peterson watering the tomato plants and the garden that needed him home. "I'm opening a regional office here," he said. It was the first time he had said it aloud. He had been thinking about it since 2 in the morning, since the family waiting room, since his mother had told him that somewhere along the way he had started believing that resources could substitute for presence. "Not a satellite office, a real one. I'll spend more time here, base more of my work here." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Because of me, because of you, and because of what this week showed me about what I've been getting wrong." He paused. "I can run most of what I do from anywhere. I chose San Francisco because that's where the company started. But you're here, and—" He stopped. "And—" she prompted. "And this is where something real happened. This week, in that hospital." He met her eyes. "I don't want to go back to the way things were and file this week as a crisis that resolved. I want it to mean something going forward." Margaret Whitmore looked at her son with an expression that was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter and more permanent than either. The expression of someone who has waited for something for a long time and has learned not to put too much pressure on the moment when it arrives. "Good," she said again. He smiled. "That's still all you have to say. When something is right, good is enough." She reached for his hand. "Now tell me about these tomato plants. Mrs. Peterson said the cages need—" "I called Mrs. Peterson. It's handled." She looked at him with undisguised surprise. "You called Mrs. Peterson?" "Emily suggested it. I called her this morning." His mother looked at him for one more moment. Then she laughed. A real laugh, clear and genuine, the first one he had heard since before the phone call that had started all of this. It was not a long laugh. But it was hers completely, the laugh he had been hearing his entire life, and it filled the room in a way that the monitors and the IV drip and all the careful institutional machinery of the hospital could not. He held on to it. The meeting at 9 the next morning lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. The hospital administrator was a man named Gerald Forsyth, who had the practiced composure of someone who had been managing institutional crises for 30 years and had learned that the first rule of managing them was to project calm regardless of what was happening beneath it. The legal counsel was younger, sharper, someone who had read Catherine's preliminary communications and understood exactly what the timeline meant. The director of nursing, Carolyn Marsh, sat with her hands folded and her expression neutral, and her eyes moving between Emily and Catherine with the specific calculation of someone reassessing a situation that had not developed as she expected. Emily sat to Catherine's right. She had come straight from her shift. She had changed out of her scrubs in the hospital locker room before coming upstairs to this conference room. And she was wearing clothes that were clean and presentable, and that she had clearly put thought into, because she understood that rooms like this one had dimensions that went beyond the words being said in them. She sat with her hands on the table and her back straight, and she looked like exactly what she was, which was someone who had been awake for 15 hours and was not remotely intimidated. Daniel sat to Catherine's left. Gerald Forsyth opened by saying that the hospital took the concerns raised very seriously, and that upon review it was clear that the corrective action letter had been issued through a flawed process. Catherine said she appreciated that. She then said that a flawed process was a description of the mechanism, not the cause, and that the cause was an institutional culture in which a nurse who accurately identified a clinical concern was subjected to administrative pressure within hours of that identification and formal corrective action within 48 hours of a case review that validated her concern. She said this without raising her voice. She said it looking directly at Gerald Forsyth. He said the hospital was committed to reviewing its processes. Catherine said she was glad to hear that and that she had some specific proposals about what that review should include, and she placed a document on the table. The document was 4 pages. Emily had helped write it. It outlined 3 things: a formal integration protocol for patient records across primary care and hospital systems within the region, beginning with a pilot program at Silver Creek Memorial within 6 months. A structured process for nursing staff to raise clinical concerns that included mandatory documentation and response timelines. And a review of the current corrective action in Emily Carter's personnel file to be completed within 72 hours, with the letter rescinded and a formal acknowledgement placed in the file indicating that her actions had been validated by subsequent clinical review. The legal counsel read it, passed it to Forsyth. Forsyth read it, looked up. "The Records Integration Initiative is a significant undertaking," Forsyth said. "The cost and timeline involved. I'll fund the pilot program," Daniel said. Everyone in the room looked at him. He had said very little up to this point. He had said it quietly without drama, the way someone states a fact that has been decided. "The technology infrastructure cost for the pilot at this hospital," Daniel continued. "I'll cover it. What I'd ask in return is that the hospital commits to the structural protocol changes in the document and agrees to participate in a regional working group on records integration that I intend to establish. The pilot becomes the model for the region." He paused. "That working group will include nursing staff, not just administrators, not just physicians. Nurses." Forsyth looked at the document again, looked at Daniel. The calculation was visible, not in any dramatic way, but in the specific quality of his attention as he processed what was in front of him. It was not a hostile offer. It was not a punitive one. It was an offer that gave the hospital a path forward that was better than the alternative, and everyone in the room understood what the alternative was, which was a retaliation case with airtight documentation and a public story that Dana Kowalski would run with the specific care of someone who knew how to make a story land. "We'd need to review the specifics of the working group structure," Forsyth said. "Of course. That's what lawyers are for." Daniel looked at him steadily. "But the principle, the commitment to participate and to include nursing staff in the design, can we agree to that today?" A pause. 3 seconds. "Yes," Forsyth said. "We can agree to that." Catherine made a note. "And Emily's file," Daniel said. Forsyth looked at Carolyn Marsh. The look lasted 2 seconds and contained a complete conversation. Marsh looked at Emily. Emily looked back at her without expression. "The corrective action will be rescinded," Forsyth said. "A formal acknowledgement will be placed in Ms. Carter's file, noting that the case review validated the concern she raised, and that her actions were consistent with the hospital's commitment to patient safety." Emily said nothing. She had been silent for the entire meeting, as Catherine had asked, but she looked at Forsyth when he said it, and the look was not triumphant. It was simply steady. The look of someone receiving information they had known was coming and were registering accurately. "Thank you," Catherine said. She gathered her documents. "I'll have the formal agreement drafted today." The meeting ended. In the hallway outside the conference room, Daniel and Emily stood together for a moment while Catherine went to make a call. The corridor was quiet. Hospital sounds in the middle distance. Morning light. Emily said, "The working group. Nursing staff involved in the design." "I meant it." "I know you did." She looked at him. "I want to be one of them." "You're already on the list." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your mother, I checked her chart before I came up here. Her numbers this morning were the best they've been since admission." He exhaled. "I know. I saw them. Another week, maybe 10 days, and she should be able to go home." Emily paused. "She's going to need follow-up care. Close monitoring for the first few months. The cardiac damage is real, it's not going to disappear. But the baseline she's at now with the right management, she can have a good quality of life." He looked at her. "Thank you, for all of it." "You've thanked me enough." "Not yet." He said it simply. But I'll stop saying it and start showing it. Emily looked at him for a moment. She had spent a week reading this man, his instincts, his blind spots, the specific ways his intelligence worked, and the specific ways his resources had insulated him from things he needed to understand. She had watched him move from the person who had walked into the hospital, assuming money would fix it, to the person who had sat in a family waiting room at 2 in the morning thinking about systems. It was not a complete transformation. People did not transform completely in 1 week. But it was real, and it was moving in the right direction, and she had learned to value that the real incremental movement over the dramatic gesture that looked like change but wasn't. "Go see your mother," she said. She went to the elevator, went back to her floor, went to the locker room, and changed back into her scrubs, because her shift technically didn't end until 6, but there were patients on the floor, and Rosa was short-staffed, and the people in those rooms didn't stop needing care because the meeting upstairs had gone well. She went to the nurse's station, picked up a chart. Rosa looked at her. "Well, letters being rescinded, formal acknowledgement going in the file, working group on records integration, 6-month pilot program at this hospital." She flipped to the medication page. "Mr. Patterson's pain levels need to be looked at again. I'm going to call the resident." Rosa stared at her. "That's it? That's all you're going to say?" "What else is there to say?" Emily was already reading the chart. "It's done. Now there's work to do." Rosa made a sound that was half laugh and half exasperation. She shook her head. She went back to her own charts. Emily called the resident about Mr. Patterson. She went to room 108. She went to room 111. She went to the new patient in room 117, who had come in overnight and whose family was frightened and needed someone to sit with them for 10 minutes and explain things in language that didn't require a medical degree to understand. She sat with them. She explained. She did her job. Margaret went home on a Thursday, 11 days after Daniel had driven through the Oregon rain to reach her hospital room. It was not a dramatic exit. There was no ceremony to it. A discharge nurse went through the paperwork. Daniel brought the car around. He had driven up from the regional office space he was in the process of leasing in Silver Creek, which was a fact that still slightly surprised him every time he thought about it, that he was leasing office space in this town, that he was reorienting something fundamental about how and where he worked, that the week in this hospital had moved something in him that he had thought was fixed. Emily was not working that morning. She was sleeping because she had worked nights all week and her body required what it required. But she had texted Margaret the night before, "Going to be off when you leave, but wanted you to know your numbers today are good. Go home and stake those tomatoes." Margaret had read the text 3 times, had showed it to Daniel, had said nothing because sometimes the right response to something that moved you was silence rather than words. She went home. Mrs. Peterson came over within 20 minutes of their arrival, because Mrs. Peterson had been waiting and watching from her window with the vigilance of someone who has been in charge of something important and wants to report back promptly. She brought soup. She reported on the tomatoes. She stayed for 45 minutes talking to Margaret with the ease of 2 women who had been neighbors for 22 years, and whose conversation required no introduction or warm-up. Daniel sat in his mother's kitchen and listened to the 2 of them talk, and felt something he had not felt in this house in years, which was simply at home. After Mrs. Patterson left, Margaret walked out to the back porch. Daniel followed. She stood looking at the tomato plants, which were staked now properly caged, the cages set back in the soil where they belonged. Someone had done it carefully. The plants were healthy, green and reaching. "Mrs. Patterson did those," Daniel said. "I know." Margaret looked at them for a long moment. She didn't have to. She wanted to. That's what people do when they care about someone. She turned to look at him. They do things they don't have to. He understood she was not only talking about Mrs. Peterson. They went inside. He made coffee, real coffee, not cafeteria coffee, and Margaret sat at her kitchen table in her own house and held the cup with both hands and looked around the room with the expression of someone relearning something they had temporarily forgotten, that ordinary things were the most valuable things, and that you only understood that completely when you had been close enough to losing them. "I want to ask you something," Daniel said. She looked at him over her coffee. "The night you were admitted, before you lost consciousness, what were you thinking about?" She was quiet for a moment. "You," she said. "Not in a frightened way. I wasn't afraid of dying specifically. I was thinking about you and about whether—" She stopped, reconsidered. "I was thinking about whether you were going to be all right, after. Whether you would let yourself grieve properly if it came to that, or whether you would close it off and go back to work and keep it somewhere sealed." She looked at her coffee. "I was thinking that I hadn't done a good enough job teaching you that grief is not a problem to be solved." He sat with that. "You did fine. I did what I could." She looked at him. "Emily taught you more in 1 week than I managed in 20 years of trying." "That's not true. She showed you what care looks like when it isn't attached to anything, not to gratitude, not to recognition, not to return. She just did it. Because the person in front of her needed it." Margaret held his gaze. "You needed to see that. I couldn't show you because I was too close. She could show you because she had no history with you. She had no reason to do anything except the right thing." He thought about Emily at 1 a.m, reading his mother's chart because she reminded her of her grandmother. He thought about the phone call to Dr. Reyes at 10:15, made in full knowledge of what the cost would be. He thought about the meeting yesterday, Emily sitting across from Gerald Forsyth without flinching, and then going back downstairs and changing into her scrubs because there were patients on the floor. "I know," he said. "Good." Margaret set her cup down. "Now, tell me about this office you're opening. I want to know how close it is," he told her. It was 4 miles from her house, close enough to have lunch with her twice a week if schedules allowed. She said that was acceptable. She said she would not be offended if it was only once a week on the weeks when work was difficult, but she expected consistency. He said he would provide consistency. She said she would believe it when she saw it, and she was looking forward to seeing it. He said so was he. 6 weeks later, the working group held its first meeting. It was a Wednesday afternoon in the community room of Silver Creek Memorial Hospital, a room that usually held family support sessions, and volunteer orientations, and the occasional administrative town hall. Today, it held 14 people, 3 nurses, 2 hospitalists, 1 health records, technology specialist, a patient advocate, 2 representatives from regional primary care practices, Catherine Park, a policy consultant Daniel had flown in from Portland, and Daniel himself. Emily was one of the 3 nurses. She sat at the table with a notebook and a pen and the focused attention she brought to everything. And when the technology specialist began describing the current state of records integration in Oregon regional health systems, she listened with the particular quality of someone who already knew what they were going to hear and was cataloging it anyway, because the cataloging was part of the work. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Emily spoke 4 times. Each time she said something specific and grounded, not theoretical, not policy-level abstraction, but the actual texture of what the records gap looked like from the floor of a hospital at 1 a.m. when a patient's medication history existed in a system nobody had thought to check. She said it in the same plain, direct way she said everything. She did not dramatize it. She did not make it about herself. She made it about the patients. The technology specialist said afterward that her input had been the most useful of anyone's in the room. Daniel watched her. He watched the way the other people in the room responded to her, the gradual shift from polite professional attention to genuine engagement the moment when the patient advocate leaned forward and said, "Yes, exactly that," in response to something Emily had said about families not knowing what questions to ask. He watched the way she took that response and built on it without making it about herself, always turning the focus back to the problem and away from her own experience of the problem. He thought about what his mother had said. She just did it, because the person in front of her needed it. After the meeting, when the room was emptying and people were gathering their things, Emily came to stand beside him. "That was a good room," she said. "You were good in it." She looked sideways at him. "I said the right things." You always say the right things. She was quiet for a moment. Nathan started the therapy program last week. She said it without preamble, the way she announced important things. He came home on Friday, and he was tired in a different way than he usually is, like something had moved that had been stuck. She paused. He asked me who paid for it. What did you tell him? I told him a patient's family. She looked at the table. He said he wanted to thank them someday. I said I'd pass it along. Daniel said nothing. Thank you, Emily said. Direct, complete. The way she thanked people when she meant it without the softening qualifications that turned gratitude into something smaller than it was. He's welcome, Daniel said. She picked up her notebook. Next meeting in 3 weeks. I'll be there. Good. She started toward the door, stopped, turned back. Your mother called me yesterday. He stared at her. She called you. She has my number. She said she wanted to check in. Emily's expression had something in it that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family as one. She told me the tomatoes are coming in well. She wanted me to know. He thought about his mother in her kitchen picking up the phone and calling a young nurse she had known for 11 days to tell her that the tomatoes were doing well. He thought about Margaret Whitmore's particular genius for connection, the way she had always understood that the smallest gestures were the ones that said the most important things. That sounds like her, he said. She also said. Emily paused, seemed to decide whether to say the rest of it, decided to. She said you seem lighter. He thought about that word. Lighter. He thought about what he had been carrying for years, the specific density of a life organized around achievement and provision, around being useful in quantifiable ways, around the belief that enough resources applied with enough intelligence would produce the right outcomes. He thought about how heavy that was, and how he had not understood it was heavy until he had spent a week in a hospital watching a young nurse operate entirely without it. Tell her she's right, he said. Emily nodded once, went through the door. He stood in the empty community room for a moment. He thought about room 114, 11 days of vigil, the specific sounds of a hospital at 3 in the morning. He thought about the night the rain stopped, and the sky cleared, and something in him had shifted alongside it, something he had not planned for and could not have strategized his way into. He thought about what it cost to be the kind of person Emily Carter was, what it took to go to work each night, knowing that the institution around you would resist what you could see, and to go anyway, and to see it anyway, and to say what needed to be said anyway. The specific daily courage of that, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that got recognized or rewarded, but the grinding ordinary kind that was required when you simply refused to stop caring when caring was inconvenient. He thought about his mother's face when she laughed. He thought about worn shoes. He thought about a chart at 1 in the morning and the line that had lived in his head since the night Emily first said it to him in a hospital hallway. She's still fighting. Somebody just needed to notice. That was it. That was the whole of it, really. The whole lesson contained in 11 words. The thing that no amount of money or strategy or well-placed phone calls could produce, but that a person with nothing except her own refusal could walk into a room and simply provide. Somebody just needed to notice. He picked up his jacket. He walked out into the Silver Creek afternoon, cool and clear. The kind of Oregon fall afternoon that felt like the world had been cleaned and reset. And he got in his car, and he drove 4 miles to his mother's house, and he let himself in with the key she had given him when he was 17. And he sat down at her kitchen table. Margaret came in from the backyard. She had dirt on her hands. She was holding a tomato. Look at this, she said. He looked. It was a good tomato. Red and round, and the specific size of something that had grown slowly and correctly in the right conditions. Perfect, he said. She sat across from him, set the tomato between them, looked at her son with the unhurried attention of a woman who had spent her whole life paying attention and intended to keep doing it for as long as she was here. Tell me about your week, she said. He told her, and the kitchen was warm, and the tomato sat on the table between them like proof of something ordinary and irreplaceable. And outside the window, Silver Creek went about its quiet life. And Daniel Whitmore sat with his mother in her house and talked to her about the things that mattered. And for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, that was exactly enough. Because some things could not be bought, built, or optimized into existence. Some things could only be earned slowly, honestly, one ordinary moment at a time, by a person finally willing to stop moving fast enough to miss them. And Daniel Whitmore had stopped. He was home. He was present. And Margaret Whitmore's kitchen table on a clear Thursday afternoon in Silver Creek, Oregon, with a tomato she had grown with her own hands, sitting in the middle of it, was exactly where he was supposed to be.